34. 198. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. Must. The Japanese undertook a number of what are now called population control methods, including registration of residents, issuance of residence certificates, unscheduled searches, and so on. They also made use of the method of reward and punishment recommended by more recent theorists of pacification. See Lee, pages 39 to 40.81. The Japanese understood that it was totally unrealistic to expect reforms or innovations to be initiated by those who were already well off, and therefore replaced the former local gentry by young and capable administrative personnel who were trained to assist the local administrators through the Sueho, the government-sponsored organization to recruit mass support for the Manchukuo regime. p. 46. Many abuses at the village level were also eliminated, in an attempt to wean the villagers from their traditional belief that the government is merely an agency of exploitation. Extensive propaganda efforts were conducted to win the hearts and minds of the villagers. Cf. pp. 55f. In comparison with American efforts at pacification, the Japanese appear to have achieved considerable success if these documents can be believed in part, apparently, because Japan was not committed to guaranteeing the persistence of the old semi-feudal order and was less solicitous of property rights. The reports indicate that by 1940, the communist guerrillas had been virtually exterminated in Manchuria. A secret report of the Office of Information of the Government of Manchukuo in April 193-9 describes the achievements of pacification in Tengwa province in glowing terms. It must be said that the economic and spiritual impact of the reconstruction activities on the citizens of the province has been very uplifting. We have observed an increase in the areas under cultivation as a result of the recovery of abandoned lands, an increase in agricultural production owing to improvements in 199. Amarai California when power ANDTHENUMANDA seeds, an increase of farmers' cash incomes as a result of improvement in market facilities. Remarkable progress among merchants and industrialists assisted by government loans, and the winning of public support through medical treatment and the administration of medicine. 82. A secret report of November 1, 939 describes the situation in a province where revolutionary development was not yet quite so successful and insurgents still operated. Most atrociously, these insurgents pillage goods, and kill and wound men and animals. They are also systematically conducting communist indoctrination operations in various villages. As a result, many villagers are led astray by the insurgents' propaganda and begin to work for the insurgents, passively or politically. All this adds to the burden carried by the pacification forces. 83. Farmers were fleeing from insurgent-infested areas in a continuous stream, though some continued to sympathize with communism. However, plans were being laid to establish confidence and destroy insurgent forces, to carry out relief of afflicted people, and, in general, to extend the work of nation-building. I have no knowledge of the reaction in Japan to whatever information was transmitted to the public about these matters. No doubt, many Japanese deplored the excesses of the pacification program, though the more reasonable presumably continued to discuss the situation in balanced and unemotional terms, taking note of the violence carried out on both sides. If there were vocal advocates of Japanese withdrawal from Manchuria, they could be shown reports of the sort just quoted, and warned of the atrocities that would be sure to follow were Japanese troops to be removed and the communist guerrillas given a free hand. Obviously, regardless of cost, the Japanese must continue to use limited means to secure law and order. And 200. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. Must. to permit the responsible elements of Manchurian society to build an independent nation free from externally directed terror. No one hated the necessary violence of pacification more than the Japanese officers in charge. Vice-Governor Itagaki described the moral dilemma that they faced in moving words. The construction of the defense hamlets must be enforced with tears. We issue small subsidy funds and severe orders to the farmers, telling them to move to a designated location by such and such a date and that this is the last order. But it is too miserable to watch the farmers destroying their accustomed houses, and to see little innocent babies wrapped in rags and smiling on carts that are carrying the household goods away. A few days ago, a girl of 16 or 17 made me weep by coming to my office at the prefectural government and kneeling down to beg me to spare her house. She said, "Do we really have to tear down our house, councillor?" She had walked a long way to town thinking, if I asked the councillor, something could be done. Watching the bony back of the little girl who was quietly led out by the office boy, I closed my eyes and told myself, "You will go to hell." The hardship of the Japanese police officers at the forefront who have to guide the coercive operation directly is beyond imagination. I was told many times while I was on my inspection tours of the front, "I cannot go on with this kind of wretched work. I will quit and go home." These words, uttered as we sat around a lamp sipping Kaoliang gin, sounded as though someone was spitting blood. In each case we had to console and keep telling each other that this was the last hill that needed to be conquered. The program was forced through mercilessly, inhumanly, without emotion as if driving a horse. As a result, more than 100 defense hamlets were constructed throughout the prefecture. These were built with blood, tears, and sweat. In Manchuria, the problem of the terrorists and communist bandits seems to have been solved by 1940. In China itself, pacification continued throughout the Pacific War. Chalmers Johnson summarizes these efforts briefly in a recent study. 85 in 201. American Power and the Mandarins. Both North and Central China, the Japanese suffered from guerrilla attacks and from their inability to distinguish a guerrilla from a villager. In the North, the policy implemented was the physical destruction of all life and property in an area where guerrillas were thought to exist. Whereas in Central China, a policy of establishing so-called model peace zones was pursued, consisting of expelling their communists from certain very rich agricultural areas and then, following this military phase, of integrating the cleared area into the Japanese satellite economy. The latter policy was far more successful, and it was possible to place the government in Chinese hands. There was also a strategic hamlet program, described in the following terms in a recent Japanese commentary. The Japanese Army tried its Xinjiang Clean Hamlet operations in Sukao in central China and its Silotson Railway Defense Village program in Shantung Province in North China. The concept of Xinjiang lies in making the village or hamlet the basis for a forming government at the grassroots level, and, by concentrating all military, political, economic and ideological effort on a single village, in building it up into a peaceful, stabilized and secure area, then by using this village as a model district, in gradually extending security and stability to cover the whole Xian county, the whole province and eventually the whole country. 86. However, external interference made it impossible to carry through this program. With far greater power to enforce their efforts and a much smaller and weaker enemy, American political scientists were not unreasonable in looking forward to greater success. So events proceeded through the terrifying decade of the 1930s. Seeking desperately for allies, Japan joined with Germany and Italy in the Tripartite Pact at a moment when Germany appeared invincible. With the termination of the JEPA. 202. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. Must. N.'s American Commercial Treaty in January 1, 940, Japan turned to other commercial channels, that is, to plans for occupation of French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, and for gaining independence for the Philippines. The expiration of the treaty was the turning point that led many moderates towards support for the Axis powers. 87. In July 1, 940, the United States placed an embargo on aviation fuel, which Japan could obtain from no other source. 88, and in September, a total embargo on scrap iron. Meanwhile, American aid to China was increasing. In September, the Tripartite Pact was signed, and Japanese troops entered northern Indochina. The goals were basically to block the flow of supplies to Chiang Kai-shek and to take steps towards acquisition of petroleum from the Dutch East Indies. On July 2, 194-1, a decision was made to move troops to southern Indochina. The decision was known to the American government, since the Japanese diplomatic code had been broken. On July 24, President Roosevelt informed the Japanese ambassador that if Japan would refrain from this step, he would use his influence to achieve the neutralization of Indochina. This message did not reach the Japanese Foreign Ministry until July 2, 7. On July 26, Japan announced publicly its plans to move troops to southern Indochina, and the United States government ordered all Japanese assets in the United States to be frozen. 89. On August I, a total embargo of oil was announced by the United States. At this point, Japan was denied access to all the vitally needed supplies outside her own control. 90. What slender hope there now remained to avoid war lay in the Hanamura talks, which had been underway since February. The nature of these talks has been a matter of some dispute. Powell points out that the American position hardened noticeably in the course of the discussions, with respect to all. 203. American power and the new Mandarins. Major issues. 91. The United States insisted on making the Axis alliance a major issue, though Japan persistently de-emphasized it. Schroeder argues that the American motive was in part selling the anticipated war with Japan to the American people, who might not agree that an attack on non-American soil on Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, or the Netherlands East Indies constituted an attack on the United States. 192. It may be that the underlying motive was to justify the forthcoming American involvement in the European war. In any event, the American terms, by November, were such that Japan would have had to abandon totally its attempt to secure special interests of the sort possessed by the United States and Britain in the areas under their domination, as well as its alliance with the Axis powers, becoming a mere subcontractor in the emerging American world system. Japan chose war, as we now know, with no expectation of victory over the United States, but in the hope that the Americans, confronted by a German victory in Europe and weary of war in the Pacific, would agree to a negotiated peace in which Japan would be recognized as the dominant power in Eastern Asia. 93. On November 7, 194-1, Japan offered to accept the principle of non-discrimination in commercial relations in the Pacific, including China, if this principle were adopted throughout the world. The qualification was, needless to say, quite unthinkable. Hull's final demand was that the principle be applied in the Japanese-occupied areas and that Japan withdraw all forces from China and Indochina. The Western powers could not be expected to respond in kind in their dominions. A few days later came the day that will live in infamy. This final exchange points clearly to what had been, for decades, the the central problem. Japan had insisted that in its plans for co-prosperity and then a new order, it was simply follow. 204. The revolutionary pacifism of A. J. must. In the precedent established by Great Britain and the United States, it was establishing its own Monroe Doctrine and realizing its manifest destiny. It is revealing to study the American response to this claim. Hell professed to be shocked. In his view of the matter, the Monroe Doctrine, as we interpret and apply it uniformly since 1823, only contemplates steps for our physical safety, whereas Japan is bent on aggression. 94 He deplored the simplicity of mind that made it difficult for Japanese generals to see why the United States, on the one hand, should assert leadership in the Western Hemisphere with their Monroe Doctrine and, on the other, want to interfere with Japan's assuming leadership in Asia, and he asked Noam, why can't the Japanese government educate the generals to a more correct understanding of this fundamental distinction? 95. American scholars were equally offended by the analogy. W. Willoughby, in a detailed analysis, concludes that no comparison can be made between the Monroe Doctrine and Japan's plans. 96. The United States, he asserts, has never resorted to the Monroe Doctrine to demand that it be given special commercial or other economic privileges in the other American states. Rather, it has exercised its powers of military intervention or of financial administration for the benefit of the peoples of the countries concerned or of those who have had just pecuniary claims against them. He cites with approval the discussion by G. H. Blakesley in Foreign Affairs, 97, which characterizes the main difference between the American and Japanese position in this way. The United States is a vast territory with a great population. Say is a dozen Caribbean republics, each with a relatively small area and population. Japan, on the other hand, is a country with a relatively small area and population vis-à-vis the vast territory and great population of China. An attitude which therefore ap. 205. AMERI California when power ANDTHENUMANDARINS pairs natural for the United States to take toward the Caribbean states does not appear natural for Japan to take toward China. This contribution to the history of imperialist apologia at least has the merit of originality. To my knowledge, no one had previously argued that attempts by one nation to dominate another are proper to the extent that the victim is smaller and weaker than the power that is bent on subjugating it. However, this argument is perhaps surpassed in acuity by Blakesley's next explanation of the fundamental error in the Japanese analogy. The United States does not need to use military force to induce the Caribbean republics to permit American capital to find profitable investment. The doors are voluntarily wide open. American willingness to submit to the people's will in the Caribbean was, in fact, nicely illustrated in the fall of 1933, a few months after Blakesley's article appeared, when Ramon Grau San Martin came into power in Cuba with a program that interrupted what Sumner Welles described as the attempt to secure a practical monopoly of the Cuban market for American imports. As Welles noted, this government was highly prejudicial to our interest. Our own commercial and export interests cannot be revived under this government. Consequently, Roosevelt refused to recognize the Grau government, and Welles commenced his intrigues, which he admitted were anomalous, with Batista, who was, in his judgment, the only individual in Cuba today who represented authority. This had rallied to his support the very great majority of the commercial and financial interests in Cuba who are looking for protection. Welles to Hull, October 4, 1933. The Grau government soon fell, with the result that the pre-1930 social and economic class structure was retained, and the important place in the Cuban economy held by foreign enterprises was not fundamentally disturbed. 98. 206. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. must. But the basic inadequacy of the Japanese analogy, as Blakesley points out, is the difference in aims. The United States aims to help the backward Caribbean countries to establish and maintain conditions of stability and prosperity. The United States does not wish to seize territory, directly or indirectly, or to assume political or economic control. And when it has seemed necessary to intervene in some revelation-tossed land, it has effected the necessary reorganization and has then withdrawn. It is this benevolence of intent that the Japanese do not share. Consequently, their appeal to the precedent of American practice is entirely without worth. The matter is simply put in a recent study of post-war American foreign policy, which is very critical of its recent directions. The American empire came into being by accident and has been maintained from a sense of benevolence. We engaged in a kind of welfare imperialism, empire building for noble ends rather than for such base motives as profit and influence. We have not exploited our empire. Have we not been generous with our clients and allies, sending them vast amounts of money and even sacrificing the lives of our own soldiers on their behalf? Of course we have. 99. In comparison with this long-standing record of benevolence, Japanese aggression stands exposed as the kind of unprecedented evil that fully merited the atom bomb. This review obviously does not exhaust the issues, but it does serve, I think, to place in context the policy alternatives that were open to the United States in 1941 and in earlier years. The predominant American opinion remains that the only proper response was the one that was adopted. In contrast, realists of the Grukenin variety take the position expressed by Schroeder, who argues against the mistake of basing policy on an emphasis on meting out justice rather than doing good. 207. American Power ANDTHEN Mandarins. The moralistic position of hell, the too hard and rigid policy with Japan, in Schroeder's view, was not based on sinister design or warlike intent, but on the sincere and uncompromising adherence to moral principles and liberal doctrines. The realistic approach of accommodation favored by Gru would not have been immoral, he argues. It would have constituted only a recognition that the American government was not then in a position to enforce its principles, reserving for America full freedom of action at some later, more favorable time. 100. Schroeder does not question that we were, in fact, meting out justice, but argues only that we were wrong, overly moralistic, to do so. He does not question the principles to which the United States adhered, but only our insistence on abiding by these principles at an inappropriate time. In contrast to the alternatives of realism and moralism, so defined, the revolutionary pacifism of must seems to me both eminently realistic and highly moral. Furthermore, even if we were to grant the claim that the United States simply acted in legitimate self-defense, subsequent events in Asia have amply, hideously, confirmed Must's basic premise that the means one uses inevitably incorporate themselves into his ends and, if evil, will defeat him. Whether Must's was in fact the most realistic and moral position at the time may be debated, but I think there is no doubt that its remoteness from the American consciousness was a great tragedy. The lack of a radical critique of the sort that Must, and a few others, sought to develop was one of the factors that contributed to the atrocity of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as the weakness and ineffectiveness of such radical critique today will doubtless lead to new and unimaginable horrors. 208. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. Must. Notes. 1. Pacifism and class war, in the Essays of A.J. Must, ed. Nat Hentoff, Indianapolis, The Bob's Merrill Go, Incorporated, 196 7, pp. 19985. 2. Daniel Bell, In Ideology Debate, Commentary, Volume 3 8, October 1964, p. 72. 3. The Movement to Stop the War in Vietnam, Essays, pp. 50,313. 4. Essays, pp. 180, 287. 5. Congressional Record, May 9, 1967. 6. The probabilities are meaningless with respect to the objective situation, but not with respect to the mentalities of those who use them as a guide to action. If anything can be more frightening than the behavior of the self-styled pragmatic and tough-minded policy makers of the Kennedy administration in this crisis, it is the attitude that remains, long after the crisis has cooled, that this was Kennedy's finest hour, in which he demonstrated his skill at the game of nuclear chicken, cf. Historian Thomas Bailey, New York Times Magazine, November 6, verse 965. 7. Where Are We Going? Essays, pages 234-60. 8. Crisis in the World and in the Peace Movement, Essays, pp. 46,578. 9. The Cold War and American Scholarship, in Francis L. Lowenheim, ed., The Historian and the Diplomat, New York, Harper & Row, Publishers, 1967, pages 123-69. Morton goes on to develop the conventional view that the Soviet Union is solely to blame for the dimming of the bright hopes for the future by the subtle challenge of political subversion and economic penetration, unthinkable to the West, of course, and by support of revolution, as in Greece, in violation of Allied wartime agreements that had placed Greece in the Western sphere of interest. As to the latter, he does not discuss the considerable evidence that indicates, rather, that Stalin was opposed to the Greek rebellion and adhered to the Churchill-Stalin settlement that divided Europe into spheres of influence. He also makes no mention of Truman's statement, immediately after Nagasaki, that Bulgaria and 209 American power and Thenumander are Brian-S. Romania, the two countries assigned predominantly to the Russian sphere in the Churchill-Stalin agreement, and not to be spheres of influence of any one power. Nor is there any reference to the American role except as one of containment. In a review in the Political Science Quarterly, Volume 82, December 1967, Arthur Schlesinger describes Morton's essay as an always intelligent account of the role of history and historians in the era of the Cold War, which will disappoint those looking for a studies until left expose of the corruptions allegedly wrought in the writing of American history by the decision to oppose communist aggression after 1945. 10. See Wesley F. Craven and James L. Cate, eds. Army Air Forces in World War / Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1953, Volume 5, pages 732-33. Arnold wanted as big a finale as possible, hoping that USASTAF could hit the Tokyo area in a 1,000 plane mission. The 20th Air Force had put up 853 B-29s and 79 fighters on the 1st of August, and Arnold thought the number could be rounded out by calling on Doolittle's 8th Air Force. Spaatz still wanted to drop the third atom bomb on Tokyo but thought that battered city a poor target for conventional bombing. Instead, he proposed to divide his forces between 7 targets. Arnold was apologetic about the unfortunate mix-up on the 1st and accepting Spaatz' amendment, assured him that his orders had been coordinated with my superiors all the way to the top. The teleconference ended with a fervid thank God from Spats. From the Marianas, 449 B-29s went out for a daylight strike on the 14th, and that night, with top officers standing by at Washington and Guam for a last-minute cancellation, 372 more were airborne. 7 planes dispatched on special bombing missions by the 509th Group brought the number of B-29s to 828, and with 186 fighter escorts dispatched, USA staff passed Arnold's goal with a total of 1014 aircraft. There were no losses, and before the last B-29 returned, President Truman announced the unconditional surrender of Japan. For the reaction of a victim, see Makoto Oda, The Meaning of Meaningless Death. Tenbo, January 1965, translated in the Journal of Social and Political Ideas in Japan, Volume 4, August 1, 966, pages 75 to 84. In the afternoon of August 14th, first 945, thousands of people died during a protracted and intensive aerial bombardment of an arsenal in Osaka. I was a witness to the tragedy. I saw dozens of corpse cell oil subjects literally consumed by service to a government which had already 210. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. MUST decided to accept the Potsdam Declaration's demand for unconditional surrender. The only reason these people died was because they happened to have been in the arsenal or environs at the time of the air raid. After what seemed an eternity of terror and anguish, we who were fortunate enough to survive emerged from our shelters. We found the corpses and the leaflets which American bombers had dropped over the destruction. The leaflets proclaimed in Japanese, "Your government has surrendered. The war is over." 1-1. Radha Binod Pal, International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Calcutta, Samuel and Co., 1953, pages 620 to 21. 12. Paul Schroeder, The Axis Alliance and Japanese-American Relations, Ithaca, NY, Cornell University Press, 1958, p. 87. 13. Ibid, p. 7. 14. Japan's Quest for Autonomy, National Security and Foreign Policy, 1930 to 1938, Princeton, N. Princeton University Press, 1966, ch. 1. 15. Masamiki Royama, Foreign Policy of Japan, 1914 to 1939, Tokyo, Japanese Council, Institute of Pacific Relations, 194-1, p. 8. He goes on to argue that it was Japanese inexperience that led to passivity and acceptance of the American attempt, with British backing, to attain hegemony in the Pacific, an obvious consequence of equality among unequals. 1-6. Quoted in R.J. C. Bdo, Tojo and the Coming of War, Princeton, N. Princeton University Press, 1961, p. 17. 17. W. C. Holland and K. L. Mitchell, eds. Problems of the Pacific, 1936, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1936, p. 195. 18. The Ryak Era, After Imperialism, Cambridge, Mass., Harvard University Press, 1965, p. 160. 19. According to William L. Newman, America Encounters Japan, Baltimore, The Johns Hopkins Press, 1963, p. 188. Over the 200,000 Japanese were living along the South Manchuria Railway and in the Kwantung Leased Territory. Japanese estimates for Manchuria as a whole are much higher. Yasaka Takagi estimated the number of Japanese in Manchuria as approximately 1 million, World Peace Machinery and the Asia Monroe Doctrine, Pacific Affairs, Volume 5, November 193-2, pp. 94-153, reprinted in Toward International Understanding, Tokyo, Kenkya-Shaw, 1954. 20. Crowley, Op. Cit. p. 103. 21. Ibid. p. 110. 211. American Power and Thenu Manda RINS. 22. Ibid. p. 140. 23. Quoted in Ibid. p. 154. 24. Ibid. p. 160. The progress of civilization is indicated by the reaction to the American destruction of cities of the Mekong Delta in early February 1st, 968. For example, the destruction of Bent with thousands of civilian casualties to protect 20 American soldiers. 20 had been killed in a garrison of 40 after the city had been taken over, virtually without a fight, by the NLF forces. 25. Japan and Her Destiny, ed. F. S. G. Piggott, New York, E. P. Dutton and Go, Incorporated, 1958. Shigemitsu describes the Manchurian incident as, in effect, one aspect of an attempted coup, of which the domestic aspect failed. From his viewpoint, Manchuria was an outlying district belonging to and colonized by China, a sparsely populated, backward country on the borders of China. By 1930, the revolutionary diplomacy of China was attempting to reverse and overthrow the unequal treaties, including long-standing Japanese interests. At a time when the only solution to world problems was free trade, Europe was reverting to a closed autarkic economy and blocking trade between Japan and the colonial possessions of the European powers. And the League of Nations was following the policy of keeping the world static, in the interests of established imperialism. The Kwantung Army acted unilaterally to protect what they took to be the legitimate interests of Japan in Manchuria. Later steps to defend Manchukuo were determined in part by the threat of ultimate communist encirclement by Communist Chinese and the Soviet Union, and in part as an attempt to counter the world movement to closed economies, which required that the Japanese must attempt to attain self-sufficiency. This view of the situation, to which I return below, was not unrealistic. 26. Shigemitsu, however, did not escape the Shanghai incident quite so lightly as did, say, American ambassador to the Dominican Republic W. Tapley Bennett or presidential envoy John Bartlow Martin 23 years later, in not dissimilar circumstances. Shigemitsu was severely wounded by a terrorist, an advocate of Korean independence, and had a leg amputated. 27. Thought and Behavior in Modern Japanese Politics, ed. Ivan Morris, New York, Oxford University Press, 1963, p. 30. Maruyama adds that while there is no doubt that the Manchurian incident acted as a definite stimulus to Japanese fascism, it must be emphasized that 212. The revolutionary pacifism of A. J. Muswheat. The fascist movement was not be something that suddenly arose after 1931. 28. Sadako Ogata, Defiance in Manchuria, The Making of Japanese Foreign Policy, 1931 to 1932, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1964, p. 178. 29. Quoted in Pal. Op. Cit. p. 195. 30. Op. Cit. pp. 1112. Royama is described by Maruyama, Op. Cit. as one of Japan's foremost political scientists and a leading pre-war liberal. 3-1. Ogata, Op. Cit. p. 132. 32. Ibid. p. 124. Cf. Also p. 185. 33. Crowley. Op. Cit. p. 138. It should be added that among the complex roots of fascism in Japan was a great concern for the suffering of the poor farmers, particularly after the Great Depression struck. See Maruyama, Op. Cit. pages 44 to 45, for some relevant quotations and comments. 34. Ogata, Op. Cit. p. 45, paraphrasing a Kwantang Ani research report. 35. Ibid. p. 42. 36. Royama, Op. Cit. p. 1137. Comparisons are difficult, but it seems that the Japanese were considerably more successful in establishing a functioning puppet government in Manchuria than the United States has ever been in Vietnam, just as the Germans were more successful in converting French nationalist forces to their ends in occupied and Vichy France than the United States has been in Vietnam. On the insurgency that developed in Manchuria, and the Japanese attempts to suppress it, see below, pages 195-201. 38. Quotes and paraphrase from Owen Lattimore, China and the Barbarians, in Joseph Barnes, ed., Empire in the East, Garden City, NY, Doubleday, Duran and Company, Incorporated, 1934, pages 3 to 36. 39. Op. Cit. See note 19. 40. Op. Cit. p. 95. 41. In addition, there were those who opposed any compromise or concession on the grounds that it would then be impossible to face the myriad spirits of the war dead. General Matsui, 194-1, cited by Maruyama, Op. Cit. p. 113. It is painful to contemplate the question of how many have died throughout history, so that others shall not have died in vain. 213. American power and the Enumanda RINS. Another crucial factor, according to Maruyama, p. 124, was the council of the senior retainers close to the emperor, who had chosen war abroad in preference to class struggle at home, and who were then less afraid of losing that war than of risking revolution, also a familiar pattern. See, for example, the discussion of the Spanish Civil War on pages 74-124 above. 42. Crowley, Op. Cit. p. 245. 43. Survey of International Affairs, London, Oxford University Press, 1926, p. 386, cited in Takagi, Op. Cit. 44. A. W. Griswold, The Far Eastern Policy of the United States, New York, Harcourt, Brace and Company, 193-8, paperback ed., New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press, 1962, p. 130. American scholarship generally agrees that these accords recognized the special position of the Japanese in the Manchuria-Mongolia region. See, for example, Robert A. Scalapino in Willard L. Thorpe, ed., The United States and the Far East, New York, Columbia University Press, 1956, p. 30. 45. Both citations from William C. Johnston, The United States and Japan's New Order, New York, Oxford University Press, 194-1, pp. 124-126. The Lansing Ishii notes, however, contained a secret protocol which in effect cancelled this concession. 46. Quoted in Irai, Op. Cit. p. 271. 47. This ISS larger force as the United States maintained in Vietnam in 1962. In late 1937, the Japanese had 160,000 troops in China. One tends to forget, these days, what was the scale of fascist figures seen a generation ago. 48. Irai op. Sit. p. 218. 49. Johnston, op. Sit. p. 214. So. Cited in Dorothy Borg, The United States and the Far Eastern Crisis of 1933 to 1938, Cambridge, Mass., Harvard University Press, 1964, p. 590. 51. Ibid, p. 42. 52. Officers of the Japanese Army in China expressed the same solicitude. General Matsui, departing to take up his post as Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Expeditionary Force in Shanghai in 1937, stated, "I am going to the front not to fight an enemy but in the state of mind of one who sets out to pacify his brother." At the Tokyo Tribunal he defined his task in the following words: "The struggle between Japan and China was always a fight between brothers within the Asian." 214. The revolutionary pacifism of A. J. Must. Family. It has been my belief all these years that we must regard this struggle as a method of making the Chinese undergo self-reflection. We do not do this because we hate them, but on the contrary because we love them too much. It is just the same as in a family when an elder brother has taken all that he can stand from his ill-behaved younger brother and has to chastise him in order to make him behave properly. Quoted by Maruyama, op. Cit. p. 95. 53. Johnston, op. Cit. p. 290. 54. Quoted in Francis C. Jones, Japan's New Order in East Asia, New York, Oxford University Press, 1954, p. 156, from the Memoirs of Cordell Hull, New York, The Macmillan Company, 1948, Volume 1, pp. 72 526. 55. Cf. Irai op. Cit. pp. 260 f. pp. 278 f. for discussion of these events. 56. Shigemitsu, op. Cit. p. 208, see Note 25. The racist American immigration law of 1924 had been a particularly bitter blow to the Japanese. In addition, there were immigration barriers in Canada, Latin America, Australia, and New Zealand. It is worthy of mention that the Japanese effort to insert a racial equality paragraph into the League of Nations resolutions endorsing the principle of equality of nations and just treatment of their nationals had been blocked by Britain. Woodrow Wilson, then in the chair, ruled that it should not be instituted in view of the serious objections of some of us. Pal. Op. Cit. pp. 317 f. Only Britain and the United States failed to vote for this resolution. See Newman, op. Cit. pages 153 to 54. 5, 7. Quoted in Ogata, op. Cit. p. 35. 58. Quoted in Shigemitsu, op. Cit. p. 221. 59. Bruno Lasker and W. L. Holland, eds. Problems of the Pacific, 1933, Chicago, University of Chicago Press, 1934, p. 560. Ibid, p. 10. 61. See Robert F. Smith, The United States and Cuba, Business and Diplomacy, 1917 to 1960, New York, Bookman Associates, 1960, p. 159. 62. Holland and Mitchell, op. Cit. p. 220. Parenthetically, We may remark that American post-war Philippine policy served to perpetuate what United Nations representative Salvador Lopez calls the pre-war system rooted in injustice and greed, which required the riveting of the Philippine economy to the American economy through free trade arrangements between the two countries, and which, in tacit L. 215, American Power ANDTHENUMANDARINS. Legends with the Filipino economic elite led to a colonial economy of the classical type, the colonial relationship, in Frank H. Goley, ed., The United States and the Philippines, Englewood Cliffs, N.J., Prentice Hall, Incorporated, 1966, pages 7-31. Furthermore, this short-sighted policy of pressing for immediate commercial advantage interrupted the Philippine Revolution that was underway at the time of the American conquest. This interruption continued, for example, with the policies of Magsaysay, who cleared away the ambivalence which had arisen in the persistent experimentation with public corporations of various kinds by a firm avowal that public policy would reflect faith in and dependence upon private enterprise. Frank H. Goley, Economic Collaboration, The Role of American Investment, in IBID, p. 109. One effect of this improvement in the political and economic aspects of the investment climate was that from 1957 to 1963 earnings accruing to American foreign investors were in excess of twice the amount of direct foreign investment in the Philippines, an interesting case of foreign aid. In fact, the preferential trade relations forced on the Philippines in 1946 virtually guaranteed American domination of the economy. Two Filipino economists, writing in the same volume, point out that acceptance of the Trade Act by the Philippines was the price for war damage payments. In view of the prevailing economic circumstances, Filipinos had no alternative but to accept, after considerable controversy and with obvious reluctance, p. 132. But the Compensating Rehabilitation Act was itself something of a fraud, since the millions of dollars of war damage payments, in effect, went back to the United States in the form of payments for imports, to the benefit of American industry and labor, p. 125. 63. Figures from John E. Orchard and H. Foster Bain, I.N. Barnes, Op. Cit. pages 39-83, 185-12, 64. Op. Cit. pp. 226, 233, 65. Roy Emmer, Op. Cit. p. 120. He adds that the new government was provisional, and willing even to accept members of the Kuomintang if they would join. 66. Ibid, p. 150. 67. Cf. Lyndon B. Johnson, August 18th, verse 967. In noting the all too obvious parallels between Japanese fascism and contemporary American imperialism in Southeast Asia, we should also not overlook the fundamental differences, in particular, the fact that Japan really was. 218. The revolutionary pacifism of A.J. Must. Fighting for its survival as a great power, in the face of great power encirclement that was no paranoid delusion. 68. Despite the vigor of the Japanese government's efforts to convey the idea that they wanted American aid in achieving a quick settlement, in 193-7, United States officials again failed to understand the situation. Borg, Op. Cit. p. 466. Unfortunately for the Japanese apologists, they were unable to use some of the devices available to their current American counterparts to explain the failure of the Chinese to accept their honorable offers. For example, the director of Harvard's East Asian Research Center, John King Fairbank, thoughtfully explains that when we offer to negotiate, we are making an honorable offer which, in our view, is a civilized and normal thing to do, but the Asian mind does not share our belief in the supremacy of law and the rights of the individual protected by law through due process, and he is thus unable to perceive our honorable intent and obvious sincerity. Boston Globe, August 19, 1967. It is only those rather superficial critics who do not understand the Asian mind who insist on taking the North Vietnamese literally when they state that negotiations can lower cessation of the bombing of North Vietnam, or who point out the moral absurdity of the plea that both the victim and his assailant cease their violence. 69. Cf. Bdo. Op. Cit. pp. 122. 134. 70. David J. Liu, from the Marco Polo Bridge T. Pearl Harbor, Washington, Public Affairs Press, 196 1, p. 19. 71. Bdo. Op. Cit. pp. 273 f. 72. Cf. Pal. Op. Cit. p. 212. 73. Ibid. p. 213. The United States was the least offender in this regard, abandoning its control over Chinese tariffs in 1928. Germany and the Soviet Union had relinquished extraterritoriality in the 1920s. The United States did so in 1942. Japan relinquished these rights in the puppet state of Manchukuo. 74. Cf. Shigemitsu, Op. Cit. p. 190. Also Liu, Op. Cit. p. 34. 75. Inthorpe, Op. Cit. p. 7. He deplores the fact that this is not well understood by Asians. Thorpe, formerly Assistant Secretary of State and member of the UN delegation, and at the time a professor of economics at Amherst, also draws the remarkable conclusion, in 1956, that one of the major international problems is the demonstrated willingness of the Soviet Union to support aggression in Indochina. The conference whose proceedings he was editing concluded finally with 217. American power and the innuendo are Brian's. The hope that the Chinese people will one day regain their liberties and again be free, p. 225, but did not specify when the people of China had previously possessed their liberties and lived in freedom. 76. September 2, 1937. Quoted in the documents of the World Conference on Vietnam, Stockholm, July 1, 967. Bertels van Henstrom, Chairman. 77. See Chomsky, Counterinsurgency in Manchuria, the Japanese Experience, Rand Corporation Memorandum RM 51-2 APA, January 1, 967, Unlimited Distribution. I am indebted to Herbert Bix for bringing this study to my attention. As is very often the case with Rand Corporation studies, it is difficult to determine whether it was written seriously or with tongue-in-cheek. There is no reason to question the scholarship, however. The original documents translated in the memorandum are particularly interesting. 78. Pacification Monthly Report of the Office of Information, Government of Manchukuo, October 1938, Lee, Op. Cit. pp. 189f. The kill ratio is omitted. 79. Report of the Military Advisory Section, Manchukuo, 193-7, Lee, Op. Cit. p. 12. 80. For an updating of such methods, see William A. Nice-Wenger, Rural Pacification in Vietnam, Praja Special Studies, New York, Frederick A. Praja, Incorporated, 1967. 81. For some discussion, see page 54. 82. Lee, Op. Cit. p. 305. Such reports illustrate a phenomenon noted by Maruyama in his analysis of the theory and psychology of ultranationalism. Acts of benevolence could coexist with atrocities, and the perpetrators were not aware of any contradiction. Here is revealed the phenomenon in which morality is subtly blended with power. Op. Cit. p. 11. Again, the reader will have no difficulty in supplying contemporary examples. 83. Lee. Op. Cit. pp. 307 f. 84. Secret Report of the Office of Information of the Government of Manchukuo, April 1, 939, entitled Pacification Activities in the Communist Bandit Area, Personal Reflections, Lee. Op. Cit. pp. 217 f. 85. Civilian Loyalties, in Wilson C. McWilliams, ed., Garrisons and Governments, San Francisco, Chandler Publishing Co., 1967, pages 86 to 87. 86. Shizuo Maruyama, The Other War in Vietnam, The Revolutionary Development Program, Japan Quarterly, Volume 14, July-September. 218. The Revolutionary Pacifism of A. J. Must. 1967, pp. 297-303. The author, a Southeast Asian specialist and editorial writer for his T. Skymban, notes the similarity to earlier Japanese efforts, but feels that the prospects for the American program are dim for a number of reasons, among them the following: the wounds inflicted on nature, so ruthlessly destroyed for this, are too brutal to see. Beautiful grasslands, the verdant forests and the rich crops have all been burned by flamethrowers, napalm bombs and chemical defoliants. The great earth has been gouged and dug over. The ugly land, no longer green, has lost its power to attract people and to stir deep in the hearts of people a love for their birthplace and their motherland. There is, he feels, little chance that revolutionary development will succeed when nature has been turned into a scorched earth and the system and the traditions born of a race of people have been destroyed. 87. Lu. Op. Cit. p. 67. 88. Cf. Nobutaka Ike, ed., Japan's Decision for War, Records of the 1941 Policy Conferences, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, 1967, p. 1189. The timing of these events is given in this order in Lu. Op. Cit. p. 188. According to Ike, Op. Cit. p. 108, the order to freeze assets was given on the evening of July 2, 5. The announcement that troops would be moved south at noon on the 26th. The reasons from the delay in transmission of Roosevelt's offer to the Japanese Foreign Ministry are obscure. It appears that there was still some room for diplomatic maneuver of this time. 90. Schroeder, Op. Cit. p. 53. He quotes General Miles as saying that the United States today is in a position to wreck completely the economic structure of the Japanese Empire, and Admiral Stark as predicting that this move, the freezing of assets, would probably lead directly to war. 91. Op. Cit. p. 545. 92. Op. Cit. pp. 100 f. 93. Ag. Op. Cit. Introduction. 94. April 20th, verse 940, cited by Schroeder. Op. Cit. p. 170. 95. Memoirs of Cordell Hull, Volume 2, p. 1032. 96. Japan's Case Examined, Baltimore, The Johns Hopkins Press. 1940, pp. 128 ff. 97. The Japanese Monroe Doctrine, Foreign Affairs, Volume 11, July 1st 933, pp. 67-178. 219. MRI California when Power and THENU Mandarins. 98. Bryce Wood, Clear Making of the Good Neighbor Policy, New York, Columbia University Press, 1962, p. 109. 99. Ronald Steele, Pax Americana, New York, The Viking Press, 1967. As Steele observes, this generosity is the price we must pay to enjoy our imperial role. Compare the remarks of H. Merivale, cited on page 58 above. Perhaps the introductory chapters of this book, from which these remarks are selected almost at random, are meant as parody, in which case they serve as witness to, rather than evidence for, the pervasive self-delusion of our highly conformist and ideologically committed society. In American scholarship dealing with the international role of the United States, it is often difficult to determine what is irony and what is sentimentality. 100. Schroeder, Op. Cit. pp. 203 ff. 20. The logic of withdrawal. International affairs can be complex, a matter of irreconcilable interests, each with a claim to legitimacy and conflicting principles, none of which can be lightly abandoned. The current Middle East crisis is a typical, painful example. American interference in the affairs of Vietnam is one of the rare exceptions to this general rule. The simple fact is that there is no legitimate interest or principle to justify the use of American military force in Vietnam. Since 1954 there has been one fundamental issue in Vietnam, whether the uncertainty and conflict left unresolved at Geneva will be settled at a local level by indigenous forces, or raised to an international level and settled through great power involvement. Alone among the great powers, the United States. Parts of this essay appeared as an editorial statement in Ramparts, Volume S, September 1967. Originally written in July 1, 967, it was extended to cover events of the intervening period in January 1968. The postscript and a few interpolated passages date from April 1968. 2-1. MRI California when Power and the NU Mandarins has insisted on the latter course. It seems clear that if the United States persists on this course, then neither the issue will be settled unilaterally through the exercise of American power, in the manner of Nazi Germany in Poland or the Soviet Union in Hungary, or it will develop into a great power conflict with unimaginable consequences. This is the situation to which Howard Zinn has addressed himself in a lucid and compelling study which advocates, very simply, that the United States accept the principle adopted by the other great powers at Geneva in 1954 and agree to turn Vietnam over to the Vietnamese. 1. The daily toll in Vietnam of innocent people is so terrible that the cessation of our military activity, the bombings, the burning and the shelling of villages, the search and destroy operations has become no longer debatable or negotiable, but a matter of urgent and unilateral action. And the only action on our part that can mitigate the torture, that can avert the still greater catastrophe that lies in wait, is to remove the military force that bears the primary responsibility. Since, happily, this is the one policy that we can successfully implement, there is a feasible alternative to devastation of Vietnam or a global conflict. The proposal that the United States withdraw will be dismissed as extremist. To those who like to describe themselves as responsible or realistic, withdrawal is politically impossible, and the analysis of the situation in Vietnam on which the proposal is based hopelessly naive. On the issue of domestic politics, Zinn argues that the so-called realists who are just to speak softly and so persuade the president are working against the reality, which is that the president responds to self-interest rather than to rational argument. If enough people speak for withdrawal, it can become politically feasible. Only a combination of factors can end there. 222. The logic of withdrawal. War, hence every citizen must put his full moral weight, his whole argument, into the balance. In fact, the government is not a monolith. As the political and military realities in Vietnam emerge through the haze of pretense and deception, the advisability, the desperate urgency of American withdrawal may become correspondingly apparent, to some at least. Consider, for example, the reaction of Senator Yen to the news that the South Vietnamese forces are unwilling to do what amounts to police work, so that so-called pacification must be taken over by the American army. If the South Vietnamese forces of Prime Minister Kia are so inadequate in numbers, intelligence, and training that they cannot handle entirely the pacification program in the villages, then instead of Americans trying to train, indoctrinate, and pacify an alien people, the time is long past due for us to withdraw to our coastal bases and eventually from Vietnam. 2. This reaction echoes that of Senator Symington after a recent Asian trip. If the South Vietnamese do not achieve this pacification, there is no point in this country continuing to pour out lives and treasure in order to protect a government that can neither consolidate nor control what has been taken from them by their own citizens and the North Vietnamese. If the United States decides to become the major factor in this pacification program, as it has since become, as well as in the fighting of the war, as it became long ago, it can only become an extended war of the white man against the Asians, on the mainland of Asia. 3. Symington's remarks are no doubt accurate, and if past history is any guide, they will soon be forgotten, as Americans become habituated to the new reality. It was, after all, not very long ago that a well-known Asian specialist, with close State Department connections, was able to draw the following conclusion in a review of Southeast Asian affairs. 223. Amarai California when power ANDTHENU Mandarins. It is unthinkable that the United States would move into the country directly, take over the conduct of the warfare against the Viet Cong, and attempt to build and manage a government for Saigon and the countryside. Apart from other difficulties, this would offer convincing proof of the communist charge of imperialism daily leveled against our government. For the United States to carry the war to the north on any large scale would have the same result. Observe that the date of this evaluation was February 1965. As we recall, convincing proof of the communist charge of imperialism was not long in coming. And today, there is very good reason to suppose that we will find ourselves in an extended war of the white man against the Asians, on the mainland of Asia. Far from being naive, the analysis of the situation that leads to the call for withdrawal not eventual but immediate seems to me entirely realistic. And the dimensions of the Vietnamese tragedy are so awesome that whatever the prospects for success may be, the responsible citizen must spare no effort to create the political climate, the background of insight and understanding, in which this call will become a powerful one. The urgency of this matter can hardly be exaggerated. It seems unlikely that the Johnson administration will be willing to face the 1968 elections with an unwinnable war on its hands. The prospects are therefore for sharp escalation, perhaps a forced confrontation with China. What is more, the rapid growth of Chinese nuclear weapon and missile capacity will surely suggest to Pentagon planners the need to act now, before the Chinese are in a position to hold an American army hostage on the fringes of Asia. With this prospect, attempts to predict what may happen next are as irrational as our Vietnamese policy itself. Zinn gives a concise but persuasive analysis of the political and moral character of the war, the international reaction, there. 224. The logic of withdrawal. Justifications that are offered for persisting in the semi-principle-led, semi-lunatic course of action in which we are now so heavily engaged. His general thesis seems to me entirely correct. The issues are so grave that I would like to go well beyond the bounds of a review and indicate some of the directions in which his discussion might be extended and elaborated. What is the situation that American policymakers face in mid-1996-7? The American military takeover of pacification is a testimony to the failure, thus far, of the effort to impose a political solution by force on an unwilling population. Its true significance is tersely indicated by an unnamed American official in Saigon who comments, "We've been playing the be nice to the Asian game for 10 years, and it's been a flop. We can't afford it any longer." 5. The American Chief of Civil Operations in the northernmost provinces attributes the failure of the revolutionary development teams to the overwhelming corruption of Vietnamese official life, to the failure to understand that until there is a contented peasantry there is no room for the opulent society of the government of Vietnam. 6. The same report in the Times goes on to give a dramatic example of the results of this corruption. It comments on the successful attack by a guerrilla force on the province capital of Can Tri on April 6, and continues, a few days later, in a series of events that were not fully reported at the time, the guerrillas moved virtually unmolested into Hue while the army and the national police did a remarkable event. Its significance indicated by the fact that it was kept from the American people at the time and still has not been frankly discussed. In Saigon itself, there are clear indications of the same demoralization or widespread involvement in guerrilla activities. For example, on February 1, 1967, Westmoreland's headquarters in central Saigon was subjected to a mortar attack. As 225. American Power and the NU Mandarins. The New York Times points out, with considerable understatement, this attack gives rise to a question of the popular support in Saigon for the South Vietnamese government. It seemed unlikely to observers that the 81mm mortar and the shells could have been transported to the house, that the roof could have been cut and the weapon set up without detection by someone in the crowded residential district. Until the shells were fired, no one called the police. Current reports confirm, once again, that every program to win the allegiance of the countryside for the South Vietnamese government has so far failed, in the opinion of most observers. To this day, 80% of the peasantry falls under Viet Cong influence if not outright control. 7. The very terminology of this report gives some insight into the reasons for the recurrent failure. It has yet to be demonstrated that the Americans are correct in their unquestioned assumption that the peasants of Vietnam are objects, incapable of political expression or allegiance, to be controlled by one side or the other. The report continues, if the South Vietnamese themselves cannot achieve support for the government among their own people, it is unlikely that giant white foreigners will be able to do this for them. Yet it is just this attempt to which we are now reduced, with the military takeover. And we can be fairly sure that this latest step will lead to new and glorious reports of success before the next rude awakening. The Saigon government has few illusions as to its legitimacy and status. Saigon officials have pointed out repeatedly that they cannot survive in an open political arena, and that therefore the Americans must destroy not only the Viet Cong military units but also its political and administrative structure by such devices as the pacification program. A clear and forthright expression of this analysis appears in an interview with one of 228. The logic of withdrawal. The top generals in the junta, a man regarded by U.S. officials as politically the most sophisticated of the group, reported by George M. Carhin in a memorandum to a group of senators. 198 the general describes the situation in the following terms. To defeat the communists we must win against them both politically and militarily. But we are very weak politically and without the strong political support of the population which the NLF have. Thus now if we defeat them militarily, they can come to power because of their greater political strength. We now have, thanks to the support of our allies, a strong military instrument. But we are without a political instrument that can compete with the communists in the South. Such a political instrument we must now begin to create, a process that will take a generation. It is unrealistic to speak of a ceasefire until after we have built up our political strength to the point where we can compete with the communists successfully. He goes on to say that the war must be carried to North Vietnam, with the commitment of 1 million American troops, then probably to China as well. Finally, he argues that it might be necessary to move on to /Volt/Va3 so as to ensure that communist power was fully removed from Vietnam, a not unrealistic forecast, if the United States continues to insist that its protégés be spared the defeat that they know to be a certainty if the struggle is ever permitted to shift to the political arena, where they lack the strong political support of the population which the NLF have. Buddhist leaders appear to share this analysis. In the cited memorandum, Kahin quotes Buddhist spokesman, obviously unidentified, who point out that the present Saigon regime, dependent for its life on United States support, can do nothing to win the war. They plead that the United States lift the tight lid that is clamped on political expression and political activity so that a government with some claim to legitimacy can. 221. American power and the NUMANDA be established, one that can proceed to make a political settlement with the National Liberation Front. Despite the outrageous suppression of Buddhist political activity, the Buddhists still appear to be confident, as they have been for years, that they can function effectively in cooperation with the NLF. The recent policy statement published by the Overseas Vietnamese Buddhist Association emphasizes this, as does the touch-middle-dotting and pathetic book by Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnam, Lotus in a Sea of Fire, and, in fact, puts forth a program for South Vietnam that is not markedly different from that of the NLF. American authorities have repeatedly indicated that they share this assessment of the Saigon government and its popular base. Both the present Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs and his predecessor have expressed their belief that neutralization of South Vietnam would lead to a communist takeover, and it is widely admitted that the American Expeditionary Force was introduced to stave off what was in essence a political defeat. In his revealing study of the Viet Cong, American Foreign Service officer Douglas Pike concludes, with ample evidence, that the NLF victory in the now long-forgotten Civil War was essentially a political and organizational victory, achieved by building a mass movement. The NLF, he states, is the only truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. Only the Buddhists whose political organization was smashed in the spring of 1966 could realistically hope to take part in a coalition with the NLF, in his judgment. General Richard Stilwell, at the time second in command in the Southeast Asian Theatre, informed Senator Young that we are putting down an insurrection, and even General Westmoreland, who now asserts that he has seen no signs of insurrection, admitted to Senator Young that the majority of the Viet Cong fighting in the Mekong Delta were born and reared the 9th, thus indicating that. 228. The logic of withdrawal. He may not know the meaning of the word insurrection. The basis for the success of the insurrection is not very obscure. Dennis Warner, as anti-communist as any newsman who has worked in Southeast Asia, pointed out years ago that in hundreds of villages all over Southeast Asia the only people working at the grassroots for an uplift in people's living standards are the communists. 10. And to the communist agitprop successes, the Americans have contributed mightily, for ample, with a terroristic bombing policy. American sources indicate that in the first year of American bombing of the South, 1965, local recruitment for the Viet Cong tripled. 11. The head of the Saigon office of Asahi Shimbun concludes that it is certain that the escalation and spread of the war, even though its results may be advantageous to the Saigon government itself, only serves to heighten still further opposition to the war among the general population, adding that the number of draft dodgers and deserters among young South Vietnamese is a sign of the failure of the war, by and large, to win the support of young people, who tend to view it as an American war. 12. Of the situation can only worsen. Saigon authorities indicate that there are now some 2 million refugees, most of them, according to the reports of war correspondents, victims of American bombardment or forced resettlement. An Associated Press report from Saigon gives the following shattering forecast. The United States High Command, preoccupied for 2 years with hunting down North Vietnamese regulars, now is looking more toward the populated valleys and lowlands where the enemy wields potent political influence and gets his sustenance. Quick gains are hoped for by forced resettlement of chronically communist areas, followed up with scorched earth operations that deny enemy troops all food, shelter, and material support. Central Highlands valleys are being denuded of all living things. People ringing the communist war zones in the south have been moved. 229. American power and the NU Mandarins. Some American observers recently in the Mekong Delta say that the Vietnamese army, long hated and feared, now is regarded as less of a threat to the countryside than the Americans. 13. Dozens of such reports can be cited. Those who advocate withdrawal are simply proposing that we eliminate this threat, as only we can do. It is hardly surprising that the peasantry refuses allegiance to a constituent assembly that could muster 3 votes out of 117 for the one land reform measure that was introduced, or that even the residents of Saigon are less than enthusiastic about a government so unbelievably corrupt that the Secretary of Industry in Key's cabinet seems to be the major supplier of drugs to the Viet Cong, of course, after receiving $250,000 in kickbacks from the American and West German suppliers. Is it obscure why the American government continues to use its military force to impose on the people of Vietnam the regime of the most corrupt, most reactionary elements in Vietnamese society. There is simply no one else who will do its binding, and resist the overwhelming popular sentiment for peace and, no doubt, neutralism. The United States government has on occasion indicated that it would not leave if asked to do so by a left-wing or even neutralist government that, in the U.S. view, did not reflect the true feelings of the South Vietnamese people or military leaders. 15. Furthermore, it will see to it that no such government will arise, and that no such opinions will be publicly expressed. Thus, in the last few months, reports from South Vietnam indicate that once again a Buddhist attempt to establish a legal political organization were frustrated and the leaders arrested. Cohen Memorandum, cited above, Note 8. Jean Raffaelli, the one Western correspondent who has remained in North Vietnam, has observed that quite apart from 230. The logic of withdrawal. Any question of politics, there is a human element of grandeur in the resistance of the Vietnamese to the assault launched against them by the world's most advanced technology. In Le Monde, a North Vietnamese doctor of international reputation is quoted as saying, "The Americans have demolished everything. All that we have built since 1954 is in ruins: hospitals, schools, factories, new dwellings. We have nothing more to lose, except for independence and liberty. But to safeguard these, believe me, we are ready to endure anything. In South Vietnam, the American attack has been far more severe, and direct report from its victims is lacking. But some statistics tell the story well enough. According to American sources, the Viet Cong are able to enlist an estimated 7,000 recruits a month. 16 recently, an extensive propaganda barrage has enthusiastically proclaimed that in March 1, 967, there were 5,557 defectors from the Viet Cong, almost twice as many as in any previous month. Only the careful reader would have noted that of these defectors, 630 were identified as military men and 301 as political cadres, the rest being peasants, probably coming for a free meal. 7,000 new recruits and 630 defectors. These figures indicate graphically by what means the American war in Vietnam must be won. The preceding description is based on reports in early 1967. Rereading it in January 1, 968, I need hardly emphasize how little the situation has changed. The savage battering of the Vietnamese continues without pause and scale. It is unique in the history of warfare. We learned that aerial bombardment alone exceeds 100 pounds of explosives per person. 12 tons of explosives per square mile, distributed almost equally between North and South Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of acres have been subjected to defoliation, with what ultimate consequences no. 231. Amarai, California, when power and the Enumanda are Brianess. One knows. Refugees in South Vietnam are counted in the millions. Why have they left their homes? The reason why the people are forced to abandon their villages and their homes is because, in most cases, practically all of the homes are completely burned to the ground by the American forces. However, the people still try to cling to their scorched land, and are removed only by compulsion. 18 literate Americans, those who have followed the well-reported horror story of Ben Sue, for example, can supply the details for themselves. 19 numerous eyewitness reports have given the lie to the cynical pretense that our targets in North Vietnam are purely military targets of steel and concrete. The chief editorial writer of Asahi Shimbun writes, I myself walked around and inspected the bombed remains of schools, hospitals, churches, temples, marketplaces, and other peaceful public facilities. 20 Lee Lockwood, Harrison Salisbury, David Cernbrun, and others have elaborated, for those who wish to know. It is no longer denied that anti-personnel weapons constitute a significant proportion of the bombing. The political situation remains as before. Elections have been held to legitimize the existing regime in American eyes, at least. To ensure the proper result, the only avowed peace candidate, O Duong Than, was ruled off the ballot, as was the candidate most likely to be a threat at the polls, General Min. He had previously been barred from the country. Communists and neutralists were excluded by electoral law. In the senatorial elections, tickets associated with striking Buddhists were excluded as pro-neutralist, and the trade union ticket was eliminated because one candidate lacked certification of his legal status. 21. As anticipated, the candidates are generally an aristocratic and urban group, including few villagers. About 90% of them live within Saigon or the surrounding province of. 232. The logic of withdrawal. Jaya Din. 22. The shenanigans involved in deciding who won the senatorial elections defy description. 23. Although a number of American political scientists declared themselves satisfied, recalling Dean Rusk's description of the May 1965 provincial elections as free elections. By our standards, the Special Committee of the South Vietnamese Constituent Assembly recommended to invalidate. The decision was reversed by a vote of 58-43 in the full assembly, under police guard, with the director of the National Police, General Noam, and his armed bodyguards conspicuously in the gallery. Van Haxu, the consecutive landowner who was Assembly Speaker, refused to announce the result, saying, "I am absolutely unwilling to accept the verdict." 24 Shortly after the elections, Truong Dinh Zu, who surprised everyone by speaking of peace and who placed second in the balloting, was arrested. Also arrested was O Truong Than, by 79 armed men in combat gi led by General Noam. 25 Among the charges, he had applied for an exit visa to the United States. "It is up to him to explain why he wants to go abroad," stated General Noam. After being held for 18 hours, he was returned to house arrest, where apparently he remains, though it is difficult to obtain information. On November 3, the Saigon government freed 6,270 prisoners in an amnesty, including 4,320 Viet Cong suspects, most of them peasants, and 120 political detainees, persons who have been held, usually without trial, for periods up to 3 years. A ranking official said, "It's safe to say that only a tiny fraction of the total was released Wednesday." The government refuses to give further information. Furthermore, it is by now also clear that the government, in the months since the elections, has fallen into the almost total paralysis, the only noticeable action being the intensive effort by the House to block the attempt to draft South Vietnamese. 233. American Power and the NU Mandarins. Boys of 18 and 19 to fight the American war. Tran Van Du, the foreign minister, explains that we are not able to organize South Vietnam politically. So we cannot accept the NLF as a political party. The integration of the front will be a political way to take over South Vietnam. 26. The Mekong Delta, with 40% of the population, and as yet, no North Vietnamese soldiers, continues to be a Viet Cong stronghold. Asked why, President states, "The main reason the Viet Middle.com remains so strongly entrenched in the Mekong Delta is that people still believe there is little difference between the French whom they called colonialists, and the Americans whom they call imperialists." 27. Another reason is pointed out by Congressman Reid, who notes that 70% of the tenant farmers of the lowlands and Mekong Delta now rent from absentee landlords who are living it up in Saigon. 28. The attempt by Congressman Reid and Moss to have the government release a detailed study of land measures in South Vietnam by the General Accounting Office has so far been unsuccessful. 29. Tran Van Du's analysis is confirmed by Hanson Baldwin, who reports that almost unanimously, U.S. officials in Vietnam view the prospect of imminent negotiations with alarm because inclusion of the NLF in a coalition would be the kiss of death. 30. This attitude towards a negotiated settlement reveals itself continually in American diplomacy, with its constant posing of new, more extreme conditions whenever an opportunity for negotiations arises, as in the Ho Chi Minh-Johnson exchange of February 1967, when President Johnson proposed, as a condition for negotiations, that we should stop augmenting our forces in South Vietnam after North Vietnam had stopped all infiltration. We, of course, would be free to continue our own supply and infiltration operations for our own far more extensive expeditionary forces, even after the 234. The logic of withdrawal. North Vietnamese desisted totally. Occasionally, spokesmen for the American government have expressed themselves quite clearly about the prospects for negotiations. For example, General Maxwell Taylor stated in August 1, 1965. The army is the power in South Vietnam. The generals are completely committed. They've burned all their bridges behind them. They would never tolerate a government that was caught surreptitiously or overtly negotiating with Hanoi or with the Viet Cong. 81. It seems unlikely that either Saigon or Washington will be trapped into negotiations, so long as the political base of those who collaborate with us in South Vietnam remains as weak as it is today. Corroborating Hansen-Baldwin's summary of opinion in Vietnam, Hedrick Smith reports from Washington that the recent elections did not produce an organized political base for the government, and, in the opinion of United States policymakers, the Saigon regime lacks sufficient popular support and cohesion to enter a political test of strength with the front. 32. The elections, although they may have temporarily calmed American public opinion, have changed little or nothing in South Vietnam. An internal report of the United States Ms. Cyan 33 in Saigon reports the gloom of American officials over the strange drift from reality regarding the U.S. role in Vietnam among the South Vietnamese people, as evidenced, for example, in the statement by a group of middle-aged citizens that the new mobilization law had been enacted at the behest of the Americans, whose real aim is the extermination of as many Vietnamese as possible, or the question of a legislator who asks, why should our young men be drafted to serve U.S. interests? The mood among Saigon intellectuals is summarized by A. 235. American Power and the Enumander R. Brian S. Retired professor who is somewhat to the right in the spectrum of Saigon intellectuals. 34. The problem, he states, is that at this point the only intellectuals of character who have committed themselves are on the other side. Ho Chi Minh retains his popularity because he bridged the gap between Vietnam and the modern world. Everyone knows and admires Ho. The only hope, as the professor sees it, is for the United States to put aside pretense and to appoint a new governor or proconsul for Vietnam. As far as the military situation is concerned, Senator Mansfield, one of the best informed members of the Senate on Southeast Asian affairs, concluded after General Westmoreland's recent reports in Washington that he saw very little, if anything, in the pattern of combat operations to indicate any weakening of the ability of the Viet Cong to keep on fighting. He believes that the NLF remains the dominant force in South Vietnam, and points out that its stronghold in the Mekong Delta has hardly been touched. The front, rather than Hanoi, is the main factor to be considered in South Vietnam. 30. There are, to be sure, certain pacified areas, some even with few American troops, for example, much of Tay Ninh province, where their caudai is quite strong. But it is interesting to investigate the details of this success in pacification. Elizabeth Bond reports that the basis appears to be a certain accommodation between the caudai and the Viet Cong. 36. Among the caudai intellectuals, the heroes remain those who advocated neutralism, particularly the former caudai pope, Pham Cong Tac, who was exiled under Diem. By some, the only one who has carried on the tradition of Pham Cong Tac is considered to be Major Nguyen Than Mung, who joined the Viet Cong with his caudai troops. The relation between this model. 236. The logic of withdrawal. Area and the Saigon government is one of strong mutual mistrust, according to this report. There has been no more revealing commentary on the situation in the American-controlled areas of South Vietnam than the testimony elicited by Congressman Donald Regal from Rutherford Potes in May 1967, released in September. 37. Mr. Potes had been, for the preceding 3 years, the number one man overseeing our economic program, the so-called Other War in Vietnam, and had just been promoted to Deputy Director of the Agency for International Development. According to this testimony, as Congressman Regal reports it, The annual U.S. commodity import program in Vietnam is actually a political ransom paid to powerful South Vietnamese commercial interests to ensure political stability in South Vietnam and ensure their continued support of the war. Potes agreed with Congressman Regal's summary statement that if we were to withdraw our aid program, the government would likely collapse over there, and for all intents and purposes the war would be over, and that if this war were conducted in a way that required greater economic sacrifices by certain elements in Vietnam, the political instability is such that the country might fly apart. The situation is such that there would not be military action by the Vietnamese military forces today had it not been for our provision of commercial imports, because of the resulting inflation, disruption, and loss of morale. He also agreed that there is certainly a substantial element of truth in Congressman Regal's judgment that without the ransom, commercial interests in South Vietnam would get their sympathizers out in the streets and bring down the government, though he felt this judgment to be harsh. Congressman Regal concludes that if we cannot establish some sort of BAL. 237. American power and Mandarins. Ants between self-sufficiency versus a growing dependency. Then we will never get out of this situation. We will be mired down there forever. He adds that all the evidence that piles up on the military side and on the non-military side shows a growing dependency. According to Mr. Potes, that is certainly a danger, and in some instances a fair conclusion. It would follow, then, if this assessment is accurate, that we will be mired down there forever. One might compare this testimony with a report by the French resident minister in 1897. The only collaborators are intriguers, disreputable or ignorant, whom we, the French, had rigged out with sometimes high ranks, which became tools in their hands for plundering the country without scruple. Despised, they possess neither the spiritual culture nor the moral fibre that would have allowed them to understand and carry out their task. 38. Apart from its rhetorical flair, this might be the testimony of Rutherford Potes today. Mr. Potes's testimony will come as no surprise to those who have been paying attention to the laments of senior American officials in Saigon. In 1959, one such official, 39, commented that in the case of Free Vietnam the lack of even a bare minimum of economic self-sufficiency makes enduring political independence only an illusion, and complained that the majority of the aid is used in a manner that maintains an extravagant standard of living. The Viet Minh, he said, can make a strong case that the United States is effectively replacing France as the new master of Free Vietnam. Potes's testimony simply shows how little things have changed. Many additional illustrations of the character of the collaborationist elements might be cited. 40 The whole situation recalls vividly other episodes in the history of colonialism. For one example, the situation in the Philippines during the period of 238. The logic of withdrawal. The Japanese occupation. The prospects are for deepening misery and still further devastation, so long as the American occupation continues. Christopher Lydon, the Boston Globe correspondent who accompanied General Gavin on his recent trip to Vietnam, concluded a series of articles reporting his impressions with a quotation from Tan That Thien, managing editor of the Vietnam Guardian, which was suppressed by the Saigon regime when it printed a report questioning the official claim that Assembly member Tran Van Van was assassinated by the Viet Cong. Thien defines what he sees as the only possible American victory. You cannot defeat the other side militarily unless you devote the next 30 or 40 years to it. You can win if you keep killing for a generation. You simply exterminate all the Vietnamese the way you killed the Indians in America, and there will be no more war. Lydon comments, this agony, if not utter desperation, among what seemed to me the most sensitive and patriotic Vietnamese, about the burden of American arms on their country is the overriding impression I carry back from this tortured capital. 41. This agony is shared by the most perceptive observers of the Vietnam tragedy, even those who are basically in support of the American military intervention. Bernard Fall, for example, in one of his last articles warned that it is Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity which is threatened with extinction, as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. 42. It is appalling beyond words that we permit this to continue. When one tries to see what lies behind the official government reports, this is the sort of picture that emerges. Of course, it is not the picture that the government seeks to present, nor the one that it succeeds, by and large, in presenting, given their 239. AMERI California when power ANDTHENU Mandarins. Enormous propaganda apparatus at its command. It is to the great credit of the American press that it does still provide information on the basis of which one who is willing to put in the time and effort can arrive at some understanding of what is taking place in Vietnam. But we must recognize that valuable as this is, it has little bearing on the state of American democracy, since the opportunity to do the research that is required to separate fact from propaganda is limited to a privileged few. In the light of what we have seen in the past 3 years, it is difficult to become excited over such matters as the ambiguity or duplicity of the American government position on the Geneva Agreements, or the numerous violations of domestic and international law that have accompanied our intervention in the internal affairs of Vietnam. Nevertheless, these matters, and in particular the reaction as they have become too clear to overlook, are quite revealing for anyone concerned with the American war in Vietnam and its implications from the future. It was, at one time, quite normal to denounce the communists for their disregard of international law and treaty obligations. Now, however, many Americans tend to scoff at such matters as irrelevant, unrealistic. Suddenly, the Constitution and the system of treaties to which we have committed ourselves, the United Nations Charter in particular, have become outmoded, inappropriate to the complexities of current history, which require a powerful executive, free to react with overwhelming military force to real-edged emergencies and attacks such as the alleged Tonkin Bay attack. In the world-dominant power, this disregard for the formalities must cause very great concern. Randolph Bourne once warned of the intellectuals who tell us that our war of all wars is stainless and thrillingly achieving for good. We have a right to become even more alarmed when 240. The logic of withdrawal. They tell us, not in so many words, to be sure, but by the policies they advocate, that our national self-interest requires that we tear to shreds the delicate fabric of international law and disregard our treaty commitments and constitutional processes. Granting the inadequacies and frequent injustice of international law and the institutions set up to give it substance, there is still much truth in the conclusion of the Lawyers' Committee on American Policy in Vietnam. The tragedy in Vietnam reveals that the rules of law, when so flagrantly disregarded, have a way of reasserting the calm wisdom underlying their creation. If international law had been followed, both Vietnam and the American people would have been spared what Secretary General U Thant has described as one of the most barbarous wars in history. 43. The disregard for law and treaty was illustrated strikingly by our behavior with respect to the Geneva Agreements of 1954. Much has been made of the fact that in a technical sense we did not clearly commit ourselves to uphold these agreements. The record, however, must not be forgotten by those who are concerned to restore a measure of decency to our international behavior. At Geneva, Mr. Biddle-Smith did explicitly commit the United States to observe the French Middle-Vietnamese Agreement on Cessation of Hostilities, and paragraphs 112 of the final declaration of the conference. Pointedly omitted was paragraph 13, which provided for consultations to ensure that the agreements are respected, an interesting omission, in the light of subsequent attempts to achieve a negotiated settlement. The final declaration states that the military demarcation line is provisional and should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary, and calls for elections under international control as part of a political settlement based on the principles of independence, unity and 241. I can power and the NU Mandarins. Territorial integrity for all of Vietnam. Apparently, the United States had no intention of fulfilling its Geneva commitment, a fact that is admitted with remarkable frankness. For example, the Honorable Kenneth T. Young, Director of Southeast Asian Affairs in the State Department from 1954 to 1958, writes that in 1954 our aim was an independent South Vietnam with a strong government responsive to the nationalist aspirations of the population. 44. Thus our aim was to violate our commitment at Geneva. This aim was part of our general program of trying to safeguard South Vietnam as part of the retainment of all or most of non-communist Asia, of helping the Vietnamese to create stability, security and prosperity south of the 1/7th parallel so as to deter aggression and subversion from the North, all in violation of our commitment at Geneva to a unified Vietnam, with supervised elections in 1956. Obviously one could hardly have supposed that North Vietnam, prior to the scheduled elections in 1956, would carry out aggression and subversion, and as events were to prove, nothing occurred in those years that could even remotely be construed in such terms, despite the Diemist repression and Diem's refusal, with our support, to undertake the 1955 consultations that were provided for by the Geneva Accords. Secretary Dulles, it will be recalled, went still further in his aims, as when he advised the French ambassador, prior to the conference, that above all, the deltas of the Red and Mekong rivers must be retained as bases from which a counterattack could recover what was lost to the Viet Minh at the conference table. 45. It would be interesting, though probably impossible, to trace the ways in which the United States and its Saigon ally acted on this concept. Bernard Fall claims, on what evidence he does not say, that constantly since 1956 inches small saboteur groups have been parachuted or infiltrated into North Vietnam, though. 242. The logic of withdrawal. The casualty rate is very high and successes, if any, are few and far between. 46. Richard Goodwin dates these attempts from 1958.47. Recall that even according to American propaganda, there was no serious threat in South Vietnam until 1959-60, when North Vietnam set in motion a systematic effort to seize control of South Vietnam by force. 48. In fact, the American government claims only that infiltration of drained South Vietnamese cadres began in 1959, even just prior to the American takeover of the war in early 1965. Surveys of Viet Cong prisoners and defectors found most native South Vietnamese guerrillas unaware of any North Vietnamese role in the war, except as a valued ally. 49. A comparative study of the success of the South Vietnamese commandos in North Vietnam and the northern trained South Vietnamese cadres sent to South Vietnam in the 1960s might provide an interesting commentary on some of the strange ideas about revolutionary guerrilla war that appear in current American propaganda. It is curious, incidentally, that today only the United States and their Communists insist that South Vietnam is a separate and independent entity. The Saigon authorities maintain, in Article 1 of the new constitution, that Vietnam, not South Vietnam, is a territorially indivisible, unified, and independent republic, of which they claim to be the rulers. Article 107 of the Constitution specifies that Article 1 cannot be amended. Hence, in their view, even if Ho Chi Minh were to have sent his entire army to South Vietnam, he would not have been guilty of aggression, but only of insurrection and subversion. There is, however, a much more dangerous development than the falsification and cynicism of the American government with respect to its international commitments and to domestic and international law, namely, the tolerance by even enlightened American opinion of the notion that we have a perfect right to. 243. Amarai California when power and the Mandarins intervene in the internal affairs of Vietnam to determine the legitimate elements in South Vietnamese society and to direct the development of social and political institutions of our choice in that unfortunate country. It is shameful but undeniable that the turmoil over the war in the United States would never have risen beyond a whisper had we met with success in our attempt to strengthen the police and security forces and other institutions contributing to a modern police state in South Vietnam. 51 is no longer even surprised to read the recommendation from a knowledgeable and quite liberal correspondent that the United States sought to send to Vietnam the best people it has, at this sensitive businesses of political reorientation, so that the field will not be left to the NLF. 111 as he points out, our Vietnamese are playing a power game, both locally and in Saigon, for their own special privileges and interest, and they have little but contempt for the villagers. Therefore, we must find a way to win allegiance for them among the peasantry. Imagine how Saville Davis would react on reading such a recommendation in Pravda. Both he and his readers take for granted, however, that the United States has the right to carry out political reorientation, not to speak of the right to use military force, anywhere in the world. The Vietnamese revolutionaries may or may not succeed in freeing their country from American domination, but they have already succeeded in shattering American complacency with regard to our international role. American power is so great that no outside force can call us to account, hence the overwhelming urgency of the effort to overcome the effects of a generation of indoctrination and a long history of self-adulation. We will simply compound the tragedy of Vietnam if we do not exploit this opportunity to break loose from the stranglehold of ideal. 244. The logic of withdrawal. And the tradition of conformism that makes a mockery of the values we pretend to hold. The first step towards political sanity must be intensive self-examination, exposure not only of what we do and what we represent in the world today, but also of the attitudes that colour and distort our perception of our international behaviour. A remarkable expression of these attitudes appears in a deservedly famous article by Neil Sheehan, written on his return from 3 years as a war correspondent in Vietnam. 52 From his direct observations, he concludes that for its own strategic and political ends, the United States is protecting a non-communist Vietnamese social structure that cannot defend itself and that perhaps does not deserve to be defended. Idealism and dedication are largely the prerogative of the enemy. In Vietnam, only the communists represent revolution and social change, and despite their brutality and deceit, remain the only Vietnamese capable of rallying millions of their countrymen to sacrifice and hardship in the name of the nation, and the only group not dependent on foreign bayonets for survival. On our side are the military, and the Mandarins drawn from the merchant and landowning families who had collaborated with the French just as they collaborate with us. 53 He points out that the existing social system defends privilege and that many young Vietnamese of peasant origin join the Viet Cong because the communists offer them their best hope of avoiding a life on the rung of the ladder where they began at the bottom. He describes the new construction in Saigon. Virtually all luxury apartments, hotels and office buildings financed by Chinese businessmen or affluent Vietnamese with relatives or connections within the regime, destined to be rented to Americans, while Saigon's workers live, as they always have, in fetid slums. 245. American power and the new Mandarins. On the city's outskirts, yet these are the lucky ones lucky, that is, in comparison with the more than 1 million refugees, most of whom have left their homes because they could no longer bear American and South Vietnamese bombs and shells or the hundreds of thousands killed and wounded, victims largely of the extraordinary firepower of American weaponry, often turned against helpless villagers by cynical South Vietnamese officials. 54 He describes the American strategy as one of creating a killing machine, and then turning this machine on the enemy in the hope that over the years enough killing will be done to force the enemy's collapse through exhaustion and despair. 55 The enemy being, for the most part, the rural population of South Vietnam. Sheehan concludes this account in the following way: despite these misgivings, I do not see how we can do anything but continue to prosecute the war, although he cannot fail to ask himself whether the United States or any nation has the right to inflict this suffering and degradation on another people for its own ends. The reason, any other course might undermine our entire position in Southeast Asia. Many people have commented on the disparity between the contents of this article and the conclusions that Sheehan expresses. But there is a more important point that has received very little attention. Sheehan begins his account by saying that when he arrived in Vietnam, he believed in what my country was doing in Vietnam, with military and economic aid and a few thousand pilots and army advisors. The United States was attempting to help the non-communist Vietnamese build a viable and independent nation-state and defeat a communist guerrilla insurgency that would subject them to a tyranny. 246. The logic of withdrawal. He is disillusioned only because of the devastating consequences for Vietnam and its people to which this attempt led. But he still does not question that we had a perfect right to use military force to determine the structure of South Vietnamese society and to defeat an insurgent movement which we had decided would subject them to a tyranny. There is no aggressor in history who could not have provided a similar justification for his actions, and many have offered precisely such justifications. The assumption that we have the right to impose our will on the Vietnamese, in the best interests, of course, is almost unchallenged. It is for this reason that one cannot be too hopeful about the prospects of reaching liberal American opinion in any fundamental way on the central issues of war and peace, freedom, and national self-determination. There are few who challenge the assumption that we have a perfect right to determine the legitimate elements in South Vietnamese society, or to use force to impose the social and political institutions that we, in our wisdom and benevolence, have selected for South Vietnam, so long as this attempt is not too costly to make it worthwhile. The spectrum of responsible opinion extends from those who proclaim openly that we have this right to those who formulate our goals in a way that presupposes it. As to the latter, consider the final report to Congress by Defense Secretary McNamara, probably as sane a voice as one is likely to hear in Washington these days. We are fighting in Vietnam, he says, to preserve the principle that political change must not be brought about by externally directed violence and military force. But it is, in his view, perfectly legitimate for externally directed violence and military force to be employed to guarantee political stability, that is, when it is the United States that exercises this force. In fact, 247. American power and the new Mandarins goes still further. We even have the right to use our military force to carry out political and social change. Thus the pacification program, which is under American military control, involves nothing less than the restructuring of Vietnamese society, but it is, in his view, a legitimate, in fact laudable program. 56. Thus the principle that we are fighting to preserve is not the principle of non-intervention by military force in the affairs of other nations. Rather, it is the principle that the United States, and the United States alone, may intervene in the internal affairs of other nations to guarantee political stability and even to restructure their society. Secretary McNamara is of course aware of the fact that the role of North Vietnam in externally directed violence has always been, and now remains, vastly lighter than our own. It is the department that he headed, the Department of Defense, that has provided most of the evidence on this matter. But North Vietnamese interference has been in support of social change of a sort that we define as illegitimate, whereas ours is in support of stability, or occasionally, restructuring, that we have determined to be quite proper. To be concise, we are fighting in Vietnam in fulfillment of our role as international judge and executioner, nothing less. Secretary McNamara's formulation of our goals in Vietnam is given in calm and measured tones and is for this reason deceptively reassuring. With less subtlety, the same presuppositions are expressed in the words of a congressman from Texas 20 years ago. No matter what else we have of offensive or defensive weapons, without superior air power America is a bound and throttled giant, impotent and easy prey to any yellow dwarf with a pocket knife. 87. 248. The logic of withdrawal. What is important in such statements as this is not the undercurrent of racism, though that is bad enough, but rather the notion that we are easy prey to these yellow dwarfs with their pocket knives. Obviously, we are easy prey to them only in their countries, where we have a perfect right to be. Why do we have this right? The answer has been given by many statesmen and scholars. It is in our national interest. President Johnson has expressed the matter quite clearly on occasion, for example, in the following statement, November 2, 1966. There are 3 billion people in the world and we have only 200 million of them. We are outnumbered 1:1. If might did make right, they would sweep over the United States and take what we have. We have what they want. Consequently, we are going to have to stand and say, might doesn't make right, as we are doing in South Vietnam, for example. Or in Guatemala, where according to Guatemalan Vice President Maruquin Rojas, American planes based in Panama take part in military operations in Guatemala in which napalm is frequently used in zones suspected of serving as refuge for the rebels. 58. When President Johnson pleads that we are defending ourselves against a superior force, that we must stand in Vietnam or else they will sweep over the United States and take what we have, he is, unfortunately, representing a substantial, probably dominant body of American opinion. To us today, it may seem difficult to understand how it could be seriously believed, 30 years ago, that a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy was threatening the survival of Germany, the bearer of the spiritual values of Western civilization. 59. To others today, it may be equally difficult to take seriously the picture of the strongest, richest nation on earth cowering in terror behind its missiles and new. 249. American power and the new Mandarins. Clear warheads, in fear that what we have will be taken away if we allow a tiny country halfway around the world to follow its own course in freedom from American domination. Nevertheless, this characterization is no caricature. People in the so-called peace movement have a tendency to regard Lyndon Johnson as an illegitimate usurper who does not represent the mainstream of American opinion. They are probably deluding themselves. Statements such as those just quoted may very well reflect prevailing American attitudes, and one who wishes to think realistically about the American imperial role would do well to bear this in mind, as he should bear in mind the fact that this is a country in which a leading liberal commentator, after all that has happened in the past 3 years, can describe the American war in Vietnam in these terms. America is fighting a war now on the principle that military power shall not compel South Vietnam to do what it does not want to do, that man does not belong to the state. This is the deepest conviction of Western civilization, and rests on the old doctrine that the individual belongs not to the state but to his creator, and therefore has inalienable rights as a person, which no magistrate or political force may violate. 60. As I have just pointed out, we are not the first nation to have seen itself as fighting to defend the deepest convictions of Western civilization. When James Reston, with the access to information that he has, can seriously contend that we have been fighting to preserve the inalienable rights of the people of Vietnam against military power or political force, we can see what a long road lies ahead before there is any hope that this country will recover its political sanity. The colonialist mentality that colors the American perception of the Vietnam War is strikingly evident in the reactions of those who are turning against the war as its monstrous character. 250. The logic of withdrawal becomes too plain to hide. Several months ago, for example, the top leaders of the International Voluntary Services resigned, some after almost a decade of work in Vietnamese villages, because they believed that our military action was proving counterproductive and threatened to alienate the majority of the Vietnamese from their American saviors. 61. The IVS group paints a grim picture of the consequences of our military intervention in Vietnam, in terms that are not unfamiliar to readers of the American press. Their resignation was intended as a protest against policies which, they predict, can only serve to drive still more of the population into association with the NLF. They assert that our commitment in Vietnam has always been to one element of Vietnamese society, the urban educated group, which has felt that a non-communist, independent government would best serve their interests and the interests of their compatriots in the rural villages of South Vietnam. That we had a right to make such a commitment and to act on it is not questioned in their statement. The tragedy unfolding in Vietnam to which Senator Morton refers is that we were unable to realize this commitment, to construct a stable government that would represent the interests of the Vietnamese, as these interests are interpreted by the urban educated group. No one would question the sincerity or dedication of the IVS leaders, or their undoubted contributions in their work in South Vietnam. But there is every reason to question their assumption that we have the right to restructure and organize South Vietnamese society, by force if necessary. Their resignation came in the fall of 1967, along lines that we have set. In essence, their position is not different from that of Lord Cornwallis, whose permanent settlement in India in 1793 restructured village society, creating a landed aristocracy on the British pattern. 25.1. American power and the Enumander RINS. There is no reason to doubt the sincerity of his belief that this civilized arrangement could only benefit the Indians in the long run. Of course, the new Squire Archie also happened to serve British interests, as the British Governor-General Lord William Bentinck put it. If security was wanting against popular tumult or revolution, I should say that the permanent settlement has this great advantage of having created a vast body of rich landed proprietors deeply interested in the continuance of British dominion and having complete command over the mass of the people. 1829. Our reasons for wanting to control Vietnam are not those of the British in India in 1829, but in Vietnam, as in the Philippines and Latin America, our efforts are directed to organizing, restructuring, the society so as to ensure the domination of those elements that will enter into partnership with us. That we should do so is not surprising, surely not to anyone who is familiar with the history of imperialism. What is extraordinary is that at this late date we should act with so little awareness of what we are doing, that we still find it possible to deceive ourselves, though few others. 62 with the classical rhetoric of long middle-decade imperialism. Before continuing with this sketch of American reactions to the war in Vietnam, I would like to cite another American military source, which gives much insight into the nature of the Viet Cong's success in the face of the titanic military force with which we have attempted to batter it to the ground. The success of this unique system of war depends upon almost complete unity of action of the entire native population. That such unity is a fact is too obvious to admit of discussion. How it is brought about and maintained is not so plain. Intimidation has undoubtedly accomplished much to this end, but fear as the only motive is hardly sufficient to account for the united and apparently spontaneous action of several millions of people. 1 Drata. 252. The logic of withdrawal in each town would effectually destroy such a complex organization. This assessment is from a United States War Department report. In the year 1900, the author is Major General Arthur MacArthur, and he is commenting, of course, on the campaign to suppress the Philippine War of National Liberation, then actively in progress. These remarks are perfectly apropos today. I quote them to dispel the thought that Vietnam is merely a unique aberration, a blunder, merely a result of the politics of inadvertence, without roots in our history and without significance for the future. There is, of course, a sense in which the liberal critics are correct when they refer to the Vietnam War as an aberration. In Vietnam, we lost control. The Vietnamese refused to play the game the way they were expected to when the war was simulated on the Rand Corporation computers. They did not realize that they were supposed to yield when the pressure reached a certain point. Therefore, we were forced to escalate beyond any reasonable level, to a stage where our economy and society can hardly bear the cost. In this respect, it is true, Vietnam is an aberration. In all other respects it is a natural consequence of the policy that was described 3/4 of a century ago by Brooks Adams, in prophetic words, when he proclaimed, "Our geographical position, our wealth, and our energy pre-eminently fit us to enter upon the development of Eastern Asia and to reduce it to part of our economic system." The suppression of the movement for Philippine independence, shortly after, was only the first attempt to put into practice the policy of reducing Eastern Asia to part of our economic system. At that time, we were defending Christianity from the savage Moors. Now, we are defending the free world from the international communist conspiracy. In other 25 J. Amarai California when power ANDTHENU Mandarins. Respects, little has changed, except for the scale of our attack. Again, the example of the Philippine War illustrates the need to turn our attention from the problems of Southeast Asia to those of the United States, to the ideological commitments on which American initiatives are based, and the national self-image that permits them to be tolerated with such equanimity, in particular, the unshakable belief in American goodwill and generosity that persists through each calamity, notably among the self-styled hard-headed and pragmatic liberals, and that stultifies political thinking and debases political discourse. We can, For example, learn a great deal about the sources of American Vietnamese policy by observing how American scholarship comes to terms with the suppression of the Philippine struggle for independence, in which, incidentally, there were well over 1,000 Filipino casualties. Thus Louis Halley argues that we could not hand the Philippines back to the Spanish tyranny, and they were in no condition to govern themselves or encompass their own defense. If we simply got out and came home, we would leave chaos behind, with the Germans and Japanese lurking in wait. Therefore, the United States, having inadvertently become responsible for the Philippines, had no alternative to assuming, itself, the obligation of governing and defending what consequently became the first item of an American overseas empire. 63. It need hardly be pointed out that it was the American expeditionary force from whom the Filipinos needed defense. Nor will I discuss the kind of society that we bequeathed them, 64, except to remark that for reasons that are perhaps obvious, the Huk guerrillas once again appear to be in control of large areas of central Luzon, setting the stage for what may be a bloody reenactment of the tragedy of Vietnam. We can also learn a good deal from the reactions of America 1/54. The logic of withdrawal. Observers to the tensions that have developed between the United States and the Philippines in the post-war period. Consider, for example, the remarks of David Sternberg, 65, who asks what has happened to the Philippine reservoir of goodwill and friendship toward Americans since formal independence was granted to our Philippine colony. To this long middle-term resident of the Philippines and former aid advisor, it appears that there were few complex problems under the American occupation. Once the scars of war had healed and America's good intentions had gained credence, and the mass of Filipinos were able to relate the realization of their personal hopes and aspirations to a benign American presence. But now, the commercial American, though still benign employer, is also a potential competitor. The old, mutually satisfactory mentor-student relation, suffused by the warmth of the benign employer to his wards, is difficult to reconstruct under the conditions of formal independence. Of course, there is hope, for example, in the cultural predisposition toward private enterprise and the existence of a small but highly competent body of planners and managers at the top level of the private economic sector. The hope is not dimmed by the fact that 70 years after the benign American presence was established by force, 3/4 of the population live under conditions unchanged since the Spanish occupation, under the continuing rule of a political and economic elite who were coopted into the colonial regime and have an affectionate respect for the American way of life. 66 A respect not unrelated, perhaps, to the great privileges that they enjoy as a consequence of the American conquest. 67. It is remarkable to see how easily perceptive and informed commentators succeed in deluding themselves as to the character of American actions and policies. For example, Roger Hill's 2511. American Power and the Mandarins. Mann, in his recently published study of policy making under the Kennedy administration, to move a nation, discusses the attempt to concentrate the peasantry in strategic hamlets in the early 1960s, maintaining that the primary role of the strategic hamlet was to provide the peasants a free choice between the Viet Cong and the government. As he makes very clear, this free choice was to be provided by careful police work inside the hamlets, for it seemed obvious that putting up defences around a village would do no good if the defences enclosed Viet Cong agents. The failure of the program he attributes to the fact that there had been no real effort to isolate the population from the Viet Cong by eliminating Viet Cong agents and supporters inside the strategic hamlets and by imposing controls on the movement of people and supplies. Viet Cong supporters and agents had no difficulty penetrating the hamlet and continuing subversion. Thus the program failed to provide the villager with physical security, so that he has a choice of refusing to cooperate with the Viet Cong, a free choice which is obviously denied him as long as Viet Cong supporters are permitted to exist in his village. There is no doubt an important difference between this level of self-deception and that of Marshal Key, who describes the philosophy of his government as 100% social revolutionary. 68 or CIA analyst George Carver, who tells us of the genuine social revolution now taking place in the urban areas of South Vietnam. 69 The natural reaction to such pronouncements is one of ridicule, but amusement fades when one begins to calculate the human cost. Let us return to Howard's study, cf. Note 1. In the light of some of these general observations, Zinn has some apt remarks about the moral blindness that permits America to remain insensitive to the agony of Vietnam. We listen with their 256. The logic of withdrawal. Languor of a people who have never been bombed, who have only been the bombardiers. We have no Hiroshima, no city of the blind and maimed, no professors haggard from long terms in jail. We have never been forced to recognize our deeds, to bow, to apologize, to promise a life of peace. We have, in other words, never been caught. Thus protest is muted and diffuse, as Uncle Sam, the white-gloved financier of counter-revolution, has removed his gloves, taken gun in hand, and moved into the jungle, and has slowly composed an enormous pattern of devastation which, if seen in its entirety, would have to be described as one of the most evil acts committed by any nation in modern times. There are, I think, certain gaps in Zinn's analysis of the factors that prevent withdrawal of what can only be described as our army of occupation. Consider the matter of prestige. Zinn disposes effectively of the claim that our prestige as a nation would be diminished by withdrawal, noting that this would satisfy a range of opinion that extends from Mad Anna to the Japanese left. But there is also the matter of internal prestige, the factor to which Eric Hobsbawm referred when he pointed out that American policy making often seems less concerned with red areas on the map than with red faces in the Pentagon. Furthermore, it may be that in some respects Zinn underestimates the subtlety of those whose arguments he counters. For example, he remarks that we see every rebellion as the result of some plot concocted in Moscow or Peking, and that the Russians make the same mistake, attributing revolts in Hungary or Poznan to bourgeois influence or to American scheming. Although one can, to be sure, become a prisoner of one's own propaganda, it is nevertheless difficult to believe that the Russian leaders so misunderstood the events of 1956. More. 257. American power and the Inhumander. Likely, they were unwilling to tolerate an erosion of their power in a sensitive buffer area and found in bourgeois influence and American scheming a useful propaganda cover. Similarly, it strains credulity to suppose that our present Secretary of State was simply deluded when he described the Paping regime in 1951 as a colonial Russian government, a Slavic Manchukuo on a larger scale. Ample evidence was available to him to show the absurdity of this evaluation, for example, in the State Department White Paper on China published not long before. More likely, as in the case of the Hungarian Revolution, it was necessary to find a way to justify a variety of long middle-range peace, strengthening the Western alliance and rearming Germany, expanding the nuclear arsenal, stemming popular revolutions in the Third World and subverting or strangling those that had taken place. Similarly, it is not easy to convince oneself that the director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, really believed that Mossadegh was willfully creating a communist state, or that Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Thomas Mann was so woefully ignorant of world affairs as to suppose that the Dominican Revolution in 1965 resulted from the machinations of a Sino-Soviet military bloc. Rather, one must adapt to current styles of acceptable international behavior. It would not do to use today the phraseology of Secretary of State Philander Knox, who sent Marines into Cuba in 1908, saying that the United States does not undertake first to consult the Cuban government if a crisis arises requiring a temporary landing somewhere. And in general, the international communist conspiracy is a perfect propaganda device to justify actions that reinforce and extend American hegemony, serving our aims just as bourgeois influence and American scheming serve those of Russian imperialism. In both cases, there is, of course, a background of fact that 258. The logic of withdrawal gives a superficial plausibility to the fabrications of the propagandist. Similarly, I think that Zinn does not go far enough in announcing the justification for the war given by the dissatisfied liberals, a very important matter if one hopes to construct a domestic political base for a policy of disengagement in Vietnam, or more generally, for a significant reorientation of American international behavior away from the policy of repression and restructuring on American terms, disguised as anti-communism and preservation of order. I have already given a number of illustrations of the ideological blinders that must be removed before sensible discussion can even begin. Others can easily be added. Consider, for example, Richard Goodwin's essay, cited in Note 47. Goodwin constructs a powerful argument against the war, but concludes nevertheless that the war is ultimately justified, in part on grounds of American self-interest, in part because of the necessity for protecting Asia from dominion or conquest by a hostile power. As to the first, the bedrock vital interest of the United States, which must serve as the single standard against which any step in policy making must be tested, is to establish that American military power, once committed to defend another nation, cannot be driven from the field even if, as in the case in question, an American withdrawal would be in the face of an enemy that is largely indigenous. 70. If we generalize this bedrock vital interest to other great powers, the outlook for the future is dim. The Soviet Union, for example, could have used this argument to justify its military intervention in Hungary, in support of what it regarded as the legitimate government, against rebels incited from the outside and including fascist elements, etc. Auto. 259. American power and the NU Mandarins maintain its missiles in Cuba, that to defend against American invasion, in which case we would not now be discussing Vietnam or anything else. Still more interesting, however, is the second argument, that we must protect Asia from dominion or conquest by a hostile power. I will not dwell on the fact that all reputable authorities agree that the Vietnamese are strongly anti-Chinese, 71, so that if we were really interested in containing Chinese expansionism, we should presumably be supporting Ho Chi Minh, along with all popular, indigenous forces on the border of China, whatever their domestic character. What seems to me most revealing, however, is the reason that Goodwin cites as underlying our commitment to protect Asia from outside force. It is the almost idealistic, compelling conviction that the one nation with the power to prevent it should not stand aside while nations unwillingly submit to foreign domination. Thus we must not undermine the central world purpose of the United States, the creation of an international order of independent states. It does not occur to him that by suppressing a victorious insurrection, we are precisely undermining this central world purpose and forcing a nation to submit to foreign domination. nor does he take note of the fact that we are unable to form a puppet government with even the legitimacy of those set up by Germany and Japan. We have not, for example, been able to find a national figure of the stature of Petain or Wang Ching-wai to mask our aggression. This sentimental faith in American benevolence, with its various corollaries, the politics of inadvertence, the inscrutability of history, is a major factor that stands in the way of the realistic and common-sense proposal that Zinn advocates. Zinn's discussion of the Munich analogy could also be used fully extended by a consideration of the views of the Kennedy. 260. The logic of withdrawal. Liberals. Goodwin, for example, is too sophisticated to accept the Munich analogy, but he goes on to offer a revealing counterthesis. He argues, first of all, that in Vietnam we are combating not aggression but internal aggression, an interesting phrase, which refers apparently to aggression by a revolutionary movement against a government maintained in power by foreign arms, and he concludes that what we face is not Munich but rather another episode in a long, continuing conflict. Other episodes include our success in Greece and Turkey, Soviet intervention in Cuba, the invasion of Korea, the bombing of Quemoy and Matsu, subversion in the Congo and Central African Republic, fighting in Malaya and the Philippines and on the Indian border. And now, he adds, they are beginning in Thailand. But with whom are we engaged in this long, continuing conflict? Certainly not the Soviet Union, which had little to do with the Sino-Indian border dispute, nor China, which did not start the civil war in Greece, nor Ho Chi Minh, who, for all his sins, is not responsible for subversion in the Congo. Nor is international communism a very convincing devil, in the wake of the Sino-Soviet split, gestures of independence in Eastern Europe and North Korea, the admitted refusal of North Vietnam, even in its present desperate straits, to kowtow to its powerful allies. In fact, there is no identifiable adversary. We are confronted with a mysterious but dangerous force, which cannot be located or specified in any concrete terms, but which is there, threatening us. While rejecting the Munich analogy, Goodwin, the liberal critic, tacitly accepts the assumption on which it is based and which gives it great plausibility. For if this force exists, then surely we must stop it in Vietnam before it lands on the beaches of Florida or Cape Cod. The unpleasant fact is that if one wishes to pursue the 26-1 American power and the Enumander RINS Munich analogy, there is only one plausible contender for the role of Hitler. And if China or Russia do involve themselves in World War III over Vietnam, we can be sure that the memory of Munich will play an important role in their calculations. 72 Arnold Toynbee has put the matter quite succinctly. The President manifestly feels that he is speaking with Churchill's voice, the Churchill of 1940, but to the ears of peoples who have suffered from Western domination in the past, his voice sounds like the Kaiser's and like Hitler's. There is surely no greater irony than the demand that to ensure world peace, the United States must develop a strategy from the containment of China. China is surrounded by American missiles and huge military bases supporting an army 8,000 miles from home. It is subject to regular bombardment from an island that is barely off the mainland, not to speak of overflights and commando raids, all under the protection of the 7th Fleet, admittedly intervening in a civil war. For 2 years, American planes have been bombing the only railroad connecting southwestern China, with its industrial center of Kunming, to the rest of the country. It happens to pass near Hanoi. Yet even a Roger Hilsman, one of the sanest voices commenting on Asian affairs, can speak of the formidable threat posed by Communist China, and can conclude that it certainly served no useful purpose for the United States to reward aggression by recognizing Communist China war by encouraging their being seated in the UN 78. it is illuminating to examine in detail Hillsman's demonstration of Chinese belligerence. The primary example of China's aggression, apart from aggression in Korea, is the support for the crude and unsophisticated insurrections in Burma, Thailand, Malaya, the Philippines, and French Indochina, which the Chinese succeeded in putting on them all. 262. The logic of withdrawal. Effective, politically sophisticated course, p. 285. The history of Chinese belligerence, of the aggression which we must be careful not to reward, is completed with these instances. 1. The cancellation of trade contacts with Japan when the Kishi government would not allow the Chinese flag to be flown over its mission in Tokyo. 2. Various unrealized threats to Hong Kong, including an appeal to nationalist leaders to make a deal. 3. The suppression of the Tibetan revolt. 4. The Sino-Indian border crisis. 5. Encouraging the local communists in a direct use of military force, first in Laos and then in South Vietnam. pp. 288f. It is not easy to decide which of these is the most telling example of Chinese aggression. Perhaps Burma, in which, according to Uthant in 1965, there has not been a single instance of outside help to the Burmese communists, during a period when Chinese nationalist forces roamed northern Burma at great cost to the Burmese. It would also be interesting to discover what evidence was available to the Director of Intelligence for the State Department regarding Chinese control, or even material assistance, in the cases of Thailand, Malaya, and the Philippines, and also to discover why this evidence has never been made public. Chinese aggression in Indochina, in contrast to the responsible and purely defensive posture of the Western powers, is of course well documented. As to Laos, Hillsman himself repeats much of the well-known story of the American attempt to subvert the legitimate government, replicating it by pro-Western neutralists and then a right-wing military dictatorship, an attempt which continued until 1962, when Kennedy, in a dramatic and sensible reversal of policy, agreed finally to support the neutralist elements that had previously been backed only by the communist powers. Quite revealing in this connection is Hillsman's judgment that the real communist 283 American power and the Enumanda RINS threat in Laos seems more likely to have been an expansion of political control based on winning peasant support in the villages. p. 112 threat rather like that posed by the 1954 Geneva Agreements, which, the Viet Minh thought, would give them half of Vietnam for sure and an excellent opportunity to win the other half through political subversion, that is, an electoral victory. p. 103. Hillsman also has relevant comments on the Sino-Indian border dispute. He observes, p. 322, that the Indians unwisely provided the Chinese ample provocation by adopting a forward strategy, establishing isolated outposts behind the Chinese outposts that India felt had encroached on what they considered their rightful territory, and Prime Minister Nehru, in the early fall of 1962, announced publicly that the Indian Army had been ordered to clear India's territory of the China's aggressors. He points out that the unilateral Chinese pullback of their victorious armies showed that we face not only a powerful enemy but a politically skillful one. p. 33-8. He does not, unfortunately, go into the background of the conflict, but excellent Western sources exist that thoroughly refute the simplistic view advanced, to my knowledge, by not a single Western scholar, that the border dispute was merely, or even primarily, a matter of Chinese aggression. The issue of Tibet we need not discuss, since whatever the facts may be, and if Western scholarship is to be trusted, they are not simply what is claimed by American propaganda. Tibet is internationally recognized as a region of China, One might with equal logic accuse the United States of aggression in Watts, or in the Mississippi Delta, where, reports indicate, thousands are starving while Washington plays politics. Elsewhere, Hilsman demonstrates Chinese aggressiveness on the basis of the principle of post hoc ergo propter hoc. 264. The logic of withdrawal. It was in November 1957, following the Soviet Sputnik success, that Mao proclaimed that the east wind prevails over the west wind and so heralded the shift from the Bandung policy of peaceful coexistence back to a hard line. In South Vietnam, incidents of guerrilla terrorism and assassination began to mount. pp. 418-19. The same claim is made in connection with his discussion of the difficulties faced by the pro-Western neutralist Phui Sanani Khon, who came to power through American intrigue in Laos. Phui and his policy also had the misfortune to come to the test just when communist policy was changing away from the peaceful coexistence of the Bandung spirit to the hard line enunciated by Mao Zedong in his East Wind over West Wind speech in Moscow in November 1957. It was during the next year that Hanoi, following this new hard line, reached the decision to begin the guerrilla war against the South. p. 119. The suggestion that it was the Chinese hard line that was responsible for the failure of the American policy of subversion in Laos is a most interesting one. According to the American reporter Arthur Doman, who appears to be Hilsman's primary source of information on Laos, the Chinese took no action at all in Laos until the end of 1959. Despite American violations of the Geneva Agreements by the supplying of arms and military training by American officers in civilian clothes, 74, and after that their interference consisted of offering support for the neutralist Suvarnabhumi government that the United States was trying desperately to replace, first by the pro-Western neutralist Phui and then by the outright fascist Phu Nos of An. However, this is not the point. To Hilsman, the aggressiveness of China and Russia is demonstrated by the fact that they supported the neutralist Suvarnabhumi against the American. 265. American power and the new Mandarins. Sponsored attempt to overthrow his government through continual and intensive subversion. As to the claim that Hanoi decided to begin guerrilla war in the South on the basis of Mao Zedong's new hard line, Hilsman makes no attempt to substantiate this allegation, which is in conflict with whatever is known of the historical record. 75. Hilsman, recall, was Director of Intelligence for the State Department and then Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. He is a Kennedy liberal and an academic expert on international affairs. His treatment of historical events and the reasoning on which he bases conclusions about such matters as Chinese aggressiveness can only be described as appalling, yet it represents the best and most sophisticated thinking that is to be found near the center of power, so the available information indicates. One cannot escape a feeling of alarm on reading Hilsman's study of how policy was set in the Kennedy administration. In discussing Chinese aggressiveness, we must bear in mind that there is a clear sense in which China has already shown itself to be very aggressive, namely, the following. We must recognize that an overt act of war has been committed by an enemy when that enemy builds a military force intended for our eventual destruction, and that the destruction of that force before it can be launched or employed is defensive action and not aggression. As a nation we must understand that an overt act of war has been committed long before the delivery of that first blow. 76. One wonders how long it will be before the American Air Force undertakes defensive action against such overt acts of war on the part of the Chinese. It would be wrong to leave this matter of American containment of China without reference to a few simple facts that 286. The logic of withdrawal. rarely seem to penetrate the American consciousness. There is something peculiarly ugly about the American reaction to the attempt of China to achieve national unity, to raise itself from penury and starvation, to erase a century of degradation. K. S. Carroll 77 puts the matter plainly, in words that Americans would do well to ponder. By trying to strangle China, which has been permanently on the edge of famine, and by threatening her with bombs, America has helped to harden the Chinese and make them what they are today. The American anti-Chinese propaganda boomerangs on occasion. Forensic editorial writers like Joseph Alsop and others periodically announce with contemptible pleasure Chinese famines which exist, fortunately, only in their imaginations, but their editorials are often read in countries with pro-American governments where famine actually rages. Sooner or later truth will out, and it is then doubly unfavorable to the Americans. First, because it is disgusting to see the world's most overfed country rejoicing that others, even if they are communist, are suffering from hunger. And secondly, because one discovers that it is not in China but in their own camp in Central or South America, for example, that people are dying of malnutrition. Today a Kwangtung peasant eats much better than a peasant in Kerala in India, and this is known in Asia. 18. While sympathizing with China's problems, one may still react with dismay, perhaps even outrage, to the authoritarian and repressive character of the Chinese state, as one may have varying reactions to the society that is developing. But there is nothing to justify our shameful treatment of China in the post-war years. With all the cynicism of the mid-20th century, it is nevertheless startling to see how easily the rhetoric of imperialism comes to American lips, sometimes muted, sometimes entirely overt. Arthur Schlesinger writes that if our killing machine achieves a victory in Vietnam, we may all be saluting the WIS. 267. American Power and the Mandarins. Dom and statesmanship of the American government. 79. That an American military victory might be a tragedy, this is unthinkable. Roger Hilsman speaks of the Korean War, Dien Bien Phu, the two Laos crises, and Vietnam, as only the opening guns of what might well be a century-long struggle for Asia. 80. What kind of struggle it will be is clear, if Laos and Vietnam are precedents. The foreign editor of Look magazine writes, "The Far East is now our Far West. The western frontier of American power today stands on the far side of the Pacific Ocean. It stretches through the island chain off the Asian mainland with 3 toeholds on the continent, Korea, Vietnam and the Thailand. We are a Pacific power, the only Pacific power. We are there to stay. This is where we have markets and, except for Japan, no rival producers. 81. These sentiments are familiar. It has been a long-standing belief, expressed by Cordell Hull, Henry Wallace, D. Nixon I and many others, that we can escape recurrent economic stagnation or internal regimentation only with ever-expanding markets. These words recall the characteristically direct formulations of Harry Truman, who proclaimed in 1947, in James Warburg's paraphrase, that the whole world should adopt the American system, which could survive in America only if it became a world system. 82. Noting also that unless the trend toward nationalization is reversed, the American way and the way of peace will be threatened. And the natural counterpart to this doctrine is neatly expressed in the 1967 prize essay of the United States Naval Institute by Professor Harold Root of Claremont College, who argues as follows. The U.S. position in the Pacific is no longer what it was in 1941. The territory which came under direct Japanese attack early in the war, the Hawaiian Islands and the Aleutians, are each soft. The logic of withdrawal. Ian states today, yet Hawaii is closer to Peking than it is to Washington, D.C. The Aleutian Islands at their westernmost tip are closer to China than they are to Seattle, Washington, where once the security of the United States could conveniently, it seemed, rest on Alaska and Hawaii in the Pacific. These two states now have the right to demand the same kind of security which each of them once helped furnish to the continental United States. Consider the implications. Our allies and our bases in Taiwan, Cameron Bay, Thailand, also have the right to demand the same kind of security which each of them now helps furnish to Alaska and Hawaii. And so on, indefinitely. Of course, we have heard all of this before. Japan once needed Manchuria for survival. Without Manchuria, it was a potted plant, without roots. And to secure Manchuria, it was obviously necessary to ensure that North China was friendly, and then all of China, and Southeast Asia, and on to the Pacific War. Our claim to special rights in Asia is, on grounds of security or economic interest, far weaker than that of Japan. Japan, however, was dwarfed in wealth and power by a colossus across the seas, and we are not. Along such lines as these, one could develop an instructive sequel to Howard Zion's discussion of Munich, dominoes, and containment. What would be the consequences of a withdrawal of American forces from Vietnam? If past events are any guide, the cessation of aggressive military action by the United States will lead to a disengagement of North Vietnamese units, as happened, apparently, during the bombing pause in January 1, 1966. It is noteworthy that no group in South Vietnam has advocated North Vietnamese involvement in an immediate political solution, and the same North Vietnamese leadership that was willing, a decade ago, to arrange a modus vivendi with Diem. 269. Amarai California and Power and the THENU Mandarins would very likely agree to negotiate the problems of Vietnam with a government that would at least respond to its diplomatic notes. Just what might emerge from the shattered debris of South Vietnamese society, no one can predict with any confidence. It is clear, however, that under the American occupation there can be only an ending tragedy. A few years ago, the Premier of Ceylon commented that the best form of foreign aid the United States can give to small countries is to abstain from interfering in their affairs. As applied to Vietnam, at least, this grim appraisal is no longer an arguable matter. Postscript. Shortly before his death, Bernard Fall told an interviewer the story of a Vietnamese who listened to an American general boasting of one of the latest victories of the Vietnam campaign. "Yes, General, I understand," said the Vietnamese, "but aren't your victories coming closer and closer to Saigon?" 83. The preceding essay was completed in January 1968. Within a week, American victories reached Saigon itself. Several months after, it seems that the Tet Offensive represents a turning point in the war. For the past decade there have been two versions of the tragedy of Vietnam. The first is that of the war correspondents. Their message has been that Vietnamese resistance is so deeply embedded in the fabric of Vietnamese society that American victory can be achieved only through annihilation. The second is the official story, too familiar to bear repetition. Time after time after time, the correspondence version has been proven correct by events. Now, in the wake of the Tet Offensive, there is only one story. Apart from lonely relics like Joseph Alsop and a few Southeast Asian scholars, everyone now seems to understand that there are only two probable endings to the Vietnam. 270. The logic of withdrawal. Tragedy, annihilation or withdrawal of the American Army of Occupation. Annihilation was the prospect foreseen by Bernard Fall in the interview just mentioned. He quotes a captured prisoner who says, "We will all die, but we will not surrender," and he concludes that Vietnam will be destroyed. Spokesmen for the NLF and North Vietnam, however, have long argued that they can win on the battlefield. In the past, their estimates have been realistic. It may be that the Tet Offensive, which brought home to the American public that the official version of the Vietnamese story was an illusion or a lie, may also have persuaded American policy planners that there are no military options remaining, short of drastically changing the nature of the war and taking a long step towards World War III. If so, this raises the prospects for peace, that is, for withdrawal of the American troops. Withdrawal may be called a negotiated settlement, it may be called victory. What is important is not the words but the substance, the return of Vietnam to the Vietnamese. It is conceivable, though unlikely, that the Vietnamese resistance will settle for less. One lesson that has been taught them in the past 20 years is that the only victories that last are military ones. The great powers cannot be trusted. They will resort to treachery and subversion to undermine any diplomatic settlement. It seems unlikely that the NLF will lay down their arms so long as they are able to maintain control of substantial parts of South Vietnam, or that they will accept token representation in a coalition, just as it is unlikely that the French resistance 25 years ago would have terminated its struggle had it been offered the Ministry of Health in the VC government. In the last days of January, some 50,000 Viet Cong, about 10% North Vietnamese, 84 took over most of the urban areas of South Vietnam, obviously with the cooperation. 27.1. AMERI California and Power ANDTHENUMANDARINS of hundreds of thousands of urban residents. The American response was, destroy. According to the Associated Press, heavy bombs, aircraft rockets, naval gunfire, napalm, tear gas and all the usual ground weapons from 8-inch howitzers to tank guns are being used in heavily populated city areas. 85. Robert Chaplin reported from Saigon. A dozen separate areas, comprising perhaps 60 or 70 blocks, had been totally burned out. These were almost all residential areas. Most of the damage was the result of rocket attacks by American armed helicopters or other planes, though some of it had been caused by artillery or ground fighting. A modem $10 million textile plant, containing 40,000 spindles, was entirely destroyed by bombs because it was suspected of being a Viet Cong hideout. The correspondent for Le Monde, forced to leave the country soon after, reported that in the popular suburbs, the front has proven that the only way to eliminate its control is through systematic destruction. To dislodge it, the Air Force had to level many residential areas. Fleeing the bombardments, tens of thousands of refugees have poured into the center of the city. 86. Hue was virtually destroyed by American troops, block by block, house by house. According to an American military source, 119 American Marines were killed in this operation, along with 584 North Vietnamese and some 3,000 civilians. 87. Charles Moore reported that in towns such as Hue, Vinh Long, Benter and Mytho, appalling destruction was wrought when encircled Allied forces took the decision to destroy the attacking Viet Cong forces by destroying the places they had occupied. 88. The American political scientist Milton Sachs has only this to say, in an article on these events, in conventional terms, it now. 272. The logic of withdrawal. Seems clear that the Communists have suffered a military defeat in the Tet Offensive. They have expended the lives of thousands of their soldiers without securing a single province or district town of significance. No word from this Southeast Asian expert about the means by which this defeat was accomplished, or its political meaning. 89. American officials on the scene manage a somewhat broader view. One official, quoted by Charles Moore, stated, "The government won the recent battles, but it is important to consider how they won. At first the Viet Cong had won and held everything in some towns except the American military compound and a South Vietnamese position. Senator Mansfield is also aware of the realities. The hamlets, villages and the cities are seen to be honeycombed with a National Liberation Front infrastructure which has undoubtedly existed for many years, which is still intact, and which may well be stronger than ever. There is not the beginning of a stable political situation in South Vietnam. 90. In a broadcast from Saigon, Howard Tuckner of NBC stated that there is no doubt that the U.S. military position in Vietnam has never been weaker. U.S. officers in Saigon now feel for the first time that the United States can lose the war militarily. 91. The military situation is not widely discussed, but it is indicated by a report that more than 100 planes and helicopters are reported destroyed or damaged, principally by Russian-built 122mm rockets that have a range of 8 miles or more. According to an unidentified congressman, 1/3 of the U.S. helicopter force in Vietnam has been destroyed or sidelined indefinitely. Losses were almost as heavy in fixed-wing aircraft, particularly in cargo planes. The Navy is reported to have sent a helicopter carrier to the northern part of South Vietnam, in the apparent hope that NLF infiltrators will at least not succeed in penetrating this sanctuary. 92. 273. American power and the new Mandarins. In the Mekong Delta, the major cities suffered heavy damage, virtual destruction in some instances, as the Americans decided in case after case to destroy the town in order to save it, in the words of the American major responsible for the victory at Bentra. 93. Still, in April, reports from the countryside are confused. However, the general situation is clear from the fact that the IVS has withdrawn most of its field workers because of security conditions. A volunteer reported in February, the number of locations at which we can safely place a volunteer have significantly decreased in recent months. Another said that we all knew that security in the countryside was getting worse and worse. 94. According to a South Vietnamese senator, Vong Sang, the government now controls only 1/3 of the country, the remaining 2/3 being occupied by the Viet Cong. 95. The nature of the American war is tersely indicated by an American official. What the Viet Cong did was occupy the hamlets we pacified just for the purpose of having the Allies move in and bomb them out. By their presence, the hamlets were destroyed. 96. The same report indicates that in Binh Dinh province, the showcase province for pacification, this had been going on, unreported, for months. The enemy moves in December, which several military men called a softening up for the offensive, resulted in a wave of Allied air strikes on villages. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Newsweek summarizes the situation in detail, quoting an IVS worker who reports from Conth that almost all of the casualties were caused by United States firepower in the American counterattack. As difficult as this may be to believe, not a single Vietnamese I have met in Saigon nor in the Delta blames the Viet Cong for the events of the past 2 weeks. 97. How surprising. The Tet offensive led to a significant change in the political. 274. The logic of withdrawal. Situation in the United States. President Johnson has indicated that he will not seek re-election. A number of peace candidates who have yet to discuss the fundamental political issues have received substantial support. For the first time, the American government appears willing to take tentative steps towards serious negotiations. It is a devastating indictment of the state of American democracy that only a major military defeat was able to bring about these changes in the political climate. If the past is any guide, only continuing military setbacks in Vietnam and the threat of serious dislocation at home will succeed in moving the government towards concrete steps that might lead to peace. For the first time, there seems a real hope that the war will end without extermination of the Vietnamese. Nevertheless, those who have devoted themselves to working for peace in Vietnam can only be saddened by the realization that they have failed to create the consciousness in this country that we have no right to win a military victory. It is the miraculous heroism of the Vietnamese resistance that has forced these tentative moves towards peace in Vietnam. To say this is not to make a political judgment with regard to the various forces in Vietnamese society, but only to recognize the bare and inescapable facts. For the so-called peace movement, the recent events pose a major challenge. The peace movement has been getting by for too long with cheap jokes about LBJ and with concentration on peripheral issues such as the bombing of North Vietnam. The challenge it now faces is to create the understanding that we have no right to set any conditions at all on a political settlement in Vietnam, that American military force must be withdrawn from Vietnam, and from the other simmering Vietnams throughout the world, that American power and resources and technical skills must be used to build and not to repress or to contain or to destroy. 275. America N power and the N Mander RINS. N notes. 1. Howardson, Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, Boston, Beacon Press, 1967. 2. Co-11 Congressional Record, June 1, 1967. 3. Quoted in /F. Stone's Weekly, April 3, 1967. 4. William Johnston, United States Policy in Southern Asia, Current History, Volume 46, February 1965, pages 65 to 70. 5. New York Times, May 13, verse 967. 6. Ibid, May 24, 1967. 7. Christian Science Monitor, May 26, verse 967. 8. Co-11 Congressional Record, April 13, verse 967, S 5054-7. 9. Ibid, May 3, 1967. 10. Dennis Warner, The Last Confucian, New York, The Macmillan Company, 1963, p. 312. 11. C. Roger Hilsman, To Move a Nation, Garden City, NY, Doubleday and Company, Incorporated, 1967, p. 529. Senator Fulbright, using official Pentagon figures, concluded that the Viet Cong had recruited 160,000 during the course of 1,965 inches. The Truth About Vietnam report on the U.S. Senate hearings of March 1966, San Diego, California, Greenleaf Classics, Incorporated, 1966, p. 320. The witness, General Maxwell Taylor, did not question this conclusion. The figure for 1964 is 45,000,12. Akioku Eshige, Youth and Nationalism in Asia, South Vietnam, Japan Quarterly, Volume 14, January to March 1, 967, pages 38 to 39. 13. Christian Science Monitor, April 24, 967. 14. See Carl Rowan, in a nationally syndicated column, March 26, 96, 7. 15. High official in Washington, explaining a statement to this effect by Ambassador Lodge, New York Times, August 13, 965. 16. John Oakes, New York Times, April 3, 967. 17. New York Times, April 6, 1967. 1-8. Shizuo Maruyama, The Other War in Vietnam, The Revolutionary Development Program, Japan Quarterly, Volume 14, July-September 1967, pp. 29, 303. 19. The Reviews of Jonathan Sills, The Village of Ben Su, New York, Alfred A. Nope, 1 967, have been most remarkable. John. 276. The Logic of Withdrawal. Dillon, in the Christian Science Monitor, December 2, 1967, regards the book as sadly incomplete because it does not draw conclusions about the value of these massive and expensive American efforts. He interprets the book as giving a mild criticism of the American and South Vietnamese roles, a conclusion which can only amaze anyone who has read it, until he realizes that Dillon sees nothing to object to in evacuation and total destruction of 4 Viet Cong-controlled villages, including Ben Suc, a thriving village of farmers who were healthy and relatively prosperous. John Mecklin, New York Times Book Review, October 29, 1967, at least realizes that the reader is likely to feel violent disgust as the enormity of Sill's picture begins to sink in, and he has to admit that much of Sill's indictment is justified, accurate and overdue. But he considers it quite unfair, for example, because it fails to mention the monstrous handicaps that plague the United States effort, specifically the lack of command authority over the Saigon regime, a fact which obviously has no relevance to the purely American operation, conducted without informing the Vietnamese, and the deplorably short tour of duty of Americans in Vietnam, making it impossible to acquire the kind of experience so badly needed in situations such as Ben Suc. He thinks, nevertheless, that the book should be required reading in the Pentagon, because of its pinpointing of critical areas where the United States could be doing a better job in Vietnam, presumably, in conducting such operations even more efficiently in the future. These reactions testify to a kind of creeping itch-manism, which in fact must also explain the limited reaction to the original New York Times report of the Ben Su operation, January 1, 1967. Pacification in Ben Su had been a total failure, so the only military or political solution for this place, according to the American colonel in charge, was forced resettlement. Of course, some of the villagers weren't too happy about it. I imagine there will be a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, but they'll do what they're told, said the colonel. Some might not do what they were told, of course. 41 villagers did not. During the day they were tracked down and killed. The conclusion? Soon the government will have no need to win the hearts and minds of Ben Suc. There will be no Ben Suc. One can hardly decide which is more scandalous, the events themselves or the mooted response. 277. Americ and Powernlthenumandrins. Mecklin, incidentally, is responsible for some of the most amazing comments on Vietnam. In a review in the New York Times Book Review, June 4, 967, he attributes to Thich Nhat Hanh the idiotic proposal that both the Americans and the Communists go away and allow the Vietnamese to work things out. As senior officer in the United States mission in Saigon from 1962 to 1964, he might, one would think, have perceived that the Viet Cong were Vietnamese, particularly since United States officials in Saigon at the end of 1962 estimated that about one half of the South Vietnamese support the NLF. Robert Sigliano, South Vietnam, Nation Under Stress, Boston, Houghton Mifflin Company, 1963, p. 145. in his mission in Torment, Garden City, NY, Doubleday and Company, Incorporated 1965. Mecklin describes the Vietnamese peasant as a man whose vocabulary is limited to a few hundred words, whose power of reason develops only slightly beyond the level of an American 6-year-old, whose mind is untrained and therefore atrophies. p. 76. But strangely, the political and military tactics of the Viet Cong, making use of techniques that were skillfully entwined in the life and character of the Vietnamese peasant, confounded not only the U.S. mission but also the aristocratic leaders of the Diem regime, pages 78 to 79. Their forces were developed to a surprisingly sophisticated degree, with jungle arms factories, radio nets, clandestine hospitals, propaganda printing presses, VC cameramen filming the action in ambushes, p. 79. To the government forces, the Viet Cong seemed to be 8 feet tall, and so on. For further information on the achievements of these atrophied minds, see Malcolm Brown, The New Face of War, Indianapolis, The Bob's Merrill Go, Incorporated, 1965. 20. Kyosa Mori, The Logic and Psychology of North Vietnam, Japan Q11 Natalie, Volume 14. July to September 1967, pages 286 to 96. According to Bernard Fall, it was the hapless refugees, fleeing, for the most part, from aerial and artillery bombardment, who account for the whole 5% of the population said to have come under government control in 1966. See his last reflections on a war, Garden City, NY. Doubleday and Company, Incorporated, 1967, p. 157. By such means we increase our control over the population of South Vietnam. To 1. R. W. Apple, New York Times, July 22, 1967. 22. Christian Science Monitor, July 8, first 967. 23. See the leader story in the Christian Science Monitor, September 20th, first 967, for an attempt to sort out what happened behind the scenes. 278. The Logic of Withdrawal. 24. For a careful analysis of the elections by an American Southeast Asian expert who has specialized in problems of electoral politics, see Dr. David Werfel Reports on Vietnam, Methodist Division of Peace and World Order, 10 Maryland Avenue North. E. Washington, D.C., September 21, 1967. 25. New York Times, September 23, first 967. 26. Christian Science Monitor, December 2nd 196 7. 27. Cited in the New Republic, January 6th, first 968, p. 29, from an interview with Henry Brandon of the London Sunday Times. 28. New York Times, December 1st date, 1967. 29. See the Christian Science Monitor, December 1st date, 1967, for many details. 30. New York Times, December 28th, first 967. 3-1. Congressional Record, August 24th, first 965, S20654. 32. New York Times, December 8th, first 967. 33. Ibid, December 6th, first 967. 34. Christian Science Monitor, January 1st 1967. 35. New York Times, November 21st, first 967. 36. Christian Science Monitor, November 24th, first 967. 37. See the Congressional Record, September 1st date, 1967, H. 1 1979, HL 2038, for a summary. 38. Resident Muslia to the Resident Superior, December 1st 897, cited in Vietnam, Fundamental Problems, Vietnamese Studies, number 12, Hanoi, Foreign Languages Publishing House, 1966, p. 3539. Lawrence Morrison, Chief of Industry Division and Mining, USOM, Saigon, 1955 to 1957, in Richard W. Lindum, ed., Vietnam, The First 5 Years, East Lansing, Michigan State University Press, 1959, p. 215. 40. See, for example, the report by David Halberstam, Return to Vietnam, Harper's, December 1st 967, pages 47 to 58. 41. Boston Globe, January 1st 2, 1967. In May 1st 968, Tan That Thien was appointed Information Minister in Saigon. 42. Last Reflections on the War, pp. 33-47. Tan That Thien's analogy to the Indian Wars appeals to the American military mind, it seems. According to Mecklin, Mission in Torment, p. 27, Admiral Felt's headquarters in Honolulu had posted outside the war room a notice which purported to be the standing orders of Rogers' Rangers in the French and Indian Wars. Testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, General Maxwell Taylor described a problem. 279. American power and the Enumander are Briannes. In Vietnam as basically one of security, I have often said it is very bad to plant the corn outside the stockade when the Indians are still around. We have to get the Indians farther away in many of the provinces to make good progress. The Truth About Vietnam, p. 267. See also Anthony Harrigan, A Guide to the War in Vietnam, Boulder, Colorado, Panther Publications, 1966, for a view of the war that is probably representative of a significant segment of American opinion. He points out that American troops are regaining a spirit that was characteristic of U.S. troops in the winning of the continent from the turbulent Indian tribes, as they fight a war where an American can't tell the VC from the friendlies, where the smiling face of the farmer on his water buffalo beyond the airstrip fence could be a VC who plans to throw a grenade at you or your airplane, where the striking Buddhists have become an instrument in the hands of the enemies of the people of South Vietnam, where the agitation over gas is another reminder that protecting a people against communist aggression usually is a thankless job, etc., etc. 43. Richard A. Falk et al., Vietnam and International Law, Flanders, N.J., O'Hare Books, 1967, p. 85. 44. United States Policy and Vietnamese Political Viability, 19,541, 967, Asian Survey, Volume 7, August 1967, pages 507 to 14. He adds the obscure remark that if this independent South Vietnam were viable, strong, popular, enlightened, and effective, then foreign and diplomatic repercussions of two Vietnams de facto would be easier to handle, particularly for regulating the relations between North and South Vietnam and future consultations and elections which we in Washington envisaged coming at some time, perhaps in 1956 or possibly a little later. But the Geneva Agreements that we were pledged to uphold say nothing about two Vietnams de facto, nor about an independent South Vietnam as a strong, viable state. Obviously, it is absurd to speak of a viable, independent state bounded by a provisional demarcation line which should not in any way be interpreted as constituting a political or territorial boundary. It is interesting, incidentally, that Mr. Young can summarize the American effort to promote political viability in Vietnam from 1954 to 1967 with not a mention of what happened to those elections that were envisaged coming in 1956 or possibly a little later. Richard Falk has commented on the hypocrisy of the accusation that North Vietnam challenged world order by its indirectors. 280. The logic of withdrawal. Saigon in South Vietnam in the 1960s, noting that in Vietnam Saigon's establishment, rather than the subsequent attempt at its removal of a political frontier at the 17th parallel represented the coercive challenge to world order, since the political settlement at Geneva in 1954 provided a formula for the nullification, rather than one for the maintenance, of the division, international law and the United States' role in Vietnam. Yale Law Journal, Volume 76, May 1, 967, p. 1118. Similarly, the United States' effort to build up the military strength of the Saigon regime, which enabled it to crush domestic opposition and institute the grim dictatorship that supporters of the American effort were later to deplore, was a clear violation of our pledge at Geneva not to use force or threat of force to disturb the accords. Secretary Dulles was as candid as Kenneth Young about our intention to disregard the Geneva Agreements, announcing our intention to build up the truly independent states of Cambodia, Laos and Southern Vietnam. Department of State Bulletin, August 2, 1954, cited Diane George M. Cahan and John W. Lewis, The United States and Vietnam, New York, The Dial Press, 1967, p. 61. It is, incidentally, remarkable that our professed dissatisfaction with the accords and announced intention not to observe them is often cited today as somehow relieving us from the obligation to honor them, as eliminating any onus for this violation. 45. Cited in R. Sigliano, Op. Cit. p. 196. From Philippe Devlers and Jean Lecture, La Fente Indochina, 1954, Paris, Dations du Sil, 1960. 46. Vietnam, The Agonizing Reappraisal, Current History, Volume 48, February 1, 965, pages 95 to 102. In his The Two Vietnams, Rev. ed. New York. Frederick A. Prager, Incorporated, 1964, Fawcett, p. 402, that the infiltration of guerrilla teams to the north has been repeatedly attempted over the past years and has met with dismal failure. Present losses are estimated to run at 85% of the total personnel engaged in such operations. This despite the air of massive tranquility that he himself observed in a visit to North Vietnam in the fall of 1962, when these operations were in progress. No guards in watchtowers, no airplane patrols. The Hanoi police don't even carry pistols. Saturday Evening Post, November 24, 962, pp. 1821. Cf. The recent eyewitness accounts by David Cernbrun and others, noting the same phenomenon, which Fall characterizes as one of the most ominous things about North Vietnam. 28.1. American Power and the Innumander R.I.N.S. 47. Richard Goodwin, Triumph or Tragedy, New York, Vintage Books, 1966, p. 26. There are many other such reports. To mention a recent one, Louis Heron writes in the London Times, April 20, 1968, from Washington, that the CIA did in fact deploy saboteurs in the north from 1959. They were parachuted in or dropped off the coast by patrol boats, and Vice President Key commanded the Air Transport Wing of the South Vietnam Air Force in 1962 and 1963. He is known to have been in charge of the parachute drops. The agents were South Vietnamese and were trained by the CIA in Special Forces camps, notably the 7th Special Forces Group. The frogmen were trained at Di Hainan. Apart from destroying bridges and other vulnerable points, they were also expected to organize guerrilla warfare, especially in the Catholic areas. Both operations were a complete fiasco. 95% casualties were admitted in 1963, but the opium trade flourished. Heron's report goes on to discuss the possible connection between these operations and the opium trade, and the report's under investigation by a Senate subcommittee that Marshal Key was dismissed from the operation for his participation in opium smuggling. 48. Dean Rusk, December 5th, 1966. Cited in Theodore Draper, Abuse of Power, New York, The Viking Press, Incorporated, 1967, p. 45. It is difficult to exaggerate the startling character of the material that Draper has assembled, particularly with respect to the pronouncements of Dean Rusk. 49. New York Times, June 7, 1965. Polls taken for CBS in November 1966 and February 1996-7 indicate that even among strong anti-communist South Vietnamese, exposed primarily to government propaganda, there still appears to be a rejection of the American idea that the war is a consequence of aggression from the North. Richard Falk, International Law and the United States Role in Vietnam, p. 102n. The results are reported in the Times, March 22, 1967. Even in this biased sample of South Vietnamese opinion, 83% were in favor of, and 5% opposed to, reunification with the North after the end of the war. An emphasis on negotiations was preferred to extension of military operations to the North by a ratio of 4-1. The Polo F. Viet Cong prisoners cited above showed that few of them considered themselves communists or could give a definition of communism, and confirmed the judgments of most observers that the Viet Cong function far more through persuasion and indoctrina. 82. The logic of withdrawal. Them through the authoritarianism of traditional armies. It has often been emphasized, even by those committed to the American effort in Vietnam, that it would be a serious mistake to consider communist power in South Vietnam as based predominantly on terrorism or military strength, or even upon the indifference of an ignorant peasantry. Sigliano, Op. Cit. p. 158. There is near unanimity, outside of the State Department, that the historical fact is that force in the struggle for the South was first used by the Diem regime, not by the Communists, that the latter was, moreover, far more restrained, that although guidance and assistance from the North may have been an important factor in the amazing success of the NLF, it would have made little headway without wide popular support, and that the war started as a civil war in the South, well before the alleged infiltration began. Joseph Buttinger, Vietnam, A Dragon Embattled, New York, Frederick A. Prager, Incorporated 1967, Volume 2, pp. 976f, 981-82. Buttinger's study is quite interesting, not only for its careful and extensive scholarship but also because he was, for many years, a strong supporter of the Diem regime and the American involvement in support of it. He explains, for example, why Diem was unable to move towards democratic, representative structures. Local elections would have given the Viet Minh control of most of the rural communities. The Viet Minh was not only popular and ineffective political control of large regions, but it alone had people with the requisite organizational skills to exploit whatever opportunities for democratic self-expression the regime opened up. Thus, freely constituted organizations too would have been captured by the Viet Minh. p. 856, he adds that the NLF was truly the Viet Minh reborn and speaks of the similarity, or better, near identity, of the Viet Minh and the NLF. He also analyzes the much greater economic progress in the North, cf. pp. 928, 966f, and notes that repression of dissidents in the North was just severe than in the South, largely, he feels, because dissidence was less dangerous, cf. pp. 964f. 50. The thrust of the American effort in Vietnam, according to Sigli Arno, who served in the Michigan State University Advisory Group in Vietnam, Op. Cit. 1963, p. 197. In contrast, precious little of American energies or resources had been devoted to political goals, as contrasted with the military and economic gains. His detailed breakdown of aid figures shows that military aid was overwhelmingly dominant, even 28a. I can power and the NUMANDARINS. In economic and social development, and that even true economic aid was largely directed to the relatively affluent. CPP 135F. For his summary. 5-1. Saville Davis, Christian Science Monitor, October 2nd 1, 1967. 52. Not a dove, but no longer a hawk. New York Times Magazine, October 9th, verse 966. 53. As to the military, Jonathan Randall points out in the New York Times, June 1st 1967, that only one officer above the rank of lieutenant colonel did not serve in the French army against the Viet Minh in the French Indochina War. Perhaps this is part of the reason why the ARVN army has little interest in the war, while the Viet Cong can take the same unwilling recruit and turn him into a tiger in 6 months. American Regimental Advisor, as it may go part way towards explaining the desertion rates that Randall cites for the elite battalions in 1966, 22% for the armed forces as a whole, 31% for the Rangers, 33% for the Marines, and 45% for the airborne battalions. 54. See Halberstam, Op. Cit. For some indication of the incredible corruption of those to whom he refers as our Vietnamese. Their cynicism has continually scandalized American reporters. Malcolm Bro '1.11e, for example, reports that Vietnamese military officers have ordered hamlets blown off the map by American sky raiders to cover cases of graft. Op. Cit. p. 210. 55. Cahin, Op. Cit. C. Note 8, reports that the medical staff of Hue Hospital estimated that almost 90% of the war casualties were occasioned by American and South Vietnamese Army air bombardments and artillery, and that an American working at King Nai Hospital estimated that about 70% of all civilian war casualties had been inflicted by American, South Korean and South Vietnamese aerial bombardment and artillery. Note that these estimates refer to areas more or less under American control, where victims can hope to reach the hospitals. What is amazing is that any substantial number of casualties in such areas are caused by American and Allied forces. Even in Saigon Hospital, Cahin saw many victims of napalm. Mostly children. He was informed by medical students that it is government policy to disperse as widely as possible napalm casualties that are brought to hospitals so that visitors will not conclude that there are so many of them. American reactions to such discoveries are often astonishing. For example, Senator Proxmire inserted into the Congressional Record, May 284. The Logic of Withdrawal. 26, 1965, S. 11719-981, A Whitewash of Administration Policy by Thomas Ross in the Chicago Sun-Times, May 23, 1965, to show how real experts support the government. Support the government he does. He also points out that the Viet Cong have achieved a high degree of immunity and move freely throughout most of the country with little fear that the local populace will betray them to the government. Military strategy has therefore been forced to shift from counterinsurgency to classical war. But, he observes, it is still much too soon to tell whether sophisticated weapons and conventional ground troops can succeed where counterinsurgency has failed. In fact, there is some evidence of popular resentment to the expanding use of napalm, a development which is not surprising if one has observed a hospital ward full of bleeding women and children seared from head to toe. While Mr. Ross and Senator Proxmy may await the evidence, others will draw their own conclusions, even before the inevitable study by the Rand Corporation. 56. Excerpts from his secret testimony appear in the New York Times, February 2, verse 968. The Viet Cong will be happy to learn, from his testimony, that we do not seek the surrender of Viet Cong forces. We would be content to see them lay down their arms and take their place as peaceful citizens of South Vietnam, or move to the north if they so desire. Presumably, the distinction between surrendering and laying down one's arms is explained in the censored part of the testimony. The remark recalls that of another leading dove, Arthur Goldberg, who announced our position before the United Nations, in what was widely described as a conciliatory statement, as being, no military forces, armed personnel or bases, are to be maintained in North or South Vietnam except those under the control of the respective governments. New York Times, September 22, verse 967. The Viet Cong, in other words, need not surrender. We ask only that it go out of existence as a military force. And when the government we have instituted establishes total military control, we will have no further interest in retaining our army in Vietnam. The German High Command could have outlined its goals in France in just the same terms. 5-7. Lyndon B. Johnson, Congressional Record, March 1, 1948, House, p. 2883. 58. Marcel Niedergang in Le Mondes Hebdomadaire, January 1, 824, 1968. The same speech was cited by Hugh O'Shaughnessy in The New Statesman, December 1, 1967, who goes on to say that similar things. 285. American Power and the New Mandarins are happening in Nicaragua, which is virtually a U.S. colony and where guerrilla warfare broke out this year. In The Nation, February 5, verse 968, pp. 166-67, Norman Diamond reports on the application in Guatemala of advanced techniques in counterinsurgency being developed in Vietnam, including heavy bombing in large areas of the country, pacification, even rerouting of rivers to cover the traces of bombings and massacres, as well as razing forests and bulldozing villages, all under the paternalistic guidance of the American advisors. The American press has yet to cover these events. In general, the failure of the press to report events in Latin America is scandalous. The coverage of Latin American events in Le Monde is greater in scope, and incomparably greater in depth, than anything to be found in the American press, which, like American scholarship, is little concerned with American-directed violence in other countries so long as it is reasonably successful. The quoted statement of the Guatemalan vice president would very likely cause something of a commotion in liberal circles were it to be published in the American press. However, Hardly an eyebrow would be raised at other parts of Need Gang's report. For example, these lines, according to M. Antonio Palacios, of the Bank of Guatemala, 2/3 of the population live in a primitive manner. The infant mortality rate is frightful. 70% of those under 20 have never been to school. The average life expectancy is scarcely more than 40 years. Hunger and